Savannah, written by Brian Evans, Theodore Hamby III, edited by Caino Jacinto, narrated by Ben Tvler. Chapter 1. Valerie Levois slowly stepped off the cat bus, which stood for Chatham Transit Authority in Savannah, Georgia, and onto Victory Drive. Valerie loved to admire the old Spanish moss trees by historic Grayson Stadium. The approximately 7-mile bus ride from her residence at Wormslow Plantation was a pleasant ride. Took her about 15 minutes to get to once she got on the bus. She awoke later than usual that day, and her routine consisted of having a cup of her freshly made sweet iced tea. Her neighbor's 17-year-old son introduced her to the internet, and while she didn't own a computer, he would order the tea online for her. She'd usually follow that up by reading the Savannah morning newspaper. She followed this up by a slow walk down the stairs of her basement, spending hours alone. She liked being alone. She especially liked being left alone. The day had begun to slowly lose the crisp daylight as the latter part of the post-meridian slowly descended upon Savannah. At 3:45 p.m., she walked into the Social Security office on the same street the bus had dropped her off, relieved that there were only 2 people ahead of her in what typically was an office filled with the unemployed and those on the downside of advantage. Taking a number from the electronic mechanism that was about the only lucky number those who walked into the building would see that day, Valerie sat quietly. With only 1 woman ahead of her, she grew increasingly anxious as she saw the time on the clock, 3:49 p.m. The time would ordinarily not concern her, nor would her patience for someone ahead of her who was going about their business. It was clear, however, that the woman ahead of her knew the employee of the Social Security office behind the glass, and they chatted it up and laughed continuously as they discussed details of occurrences they apparently shared at the local bar together. "Oh, for the love of God," Valerie whispered anxiously to herself. Valerie stood up and walked slowly toward the window, standing behind the woman who continued to pretend as if there were no one else in the room but her, ignoring the grunts that Valerie made to make her presence known to both. These only seemed to irritate the employee more than to get her attention. The employee, Nancy Carter, a 45-year-old recent divorcee from her husband Matthew — it was Nancy playing the field during the 16-year marriage — just continued to banter away with a friend. The woman in front of her slowly turned away at 3:49 p.m., and Valerie slowly approached the window. At 77 years old, she was slow to move forward. She tried to make a smile. Beneath it had a brewing few choice words that she hadn't used in many years. Still, the faint smile was all that she could muster. The employee continued to look down at her desk as if Valerie were not even there. Valerie saw an envelope on Nancy's desk, a desk that rotated employees routinely. Each desk was simply a space behind the glass. There were no family photos as a result, no flowers, and nothing that would personalize the area to any given employee. The envelope was a check, Valerie's check, summed up by the entrance of her name at electronic check-in and brought up by a backroom staffer who monitored the check-ins of the more elderly clients who would come to collect their Social Security checks. This was going to be an easy process from here in, and Valerie was just happy to have caught the woman at 3:59 p.m. "Hello, darling, that's my check right there in front of you," said Valerie, making her best efforts to be sweet. The woman, a white woman who had the look of general defeat crinkled in her skin, a defeat caused by her own lifelong mission to look for an easy way that always ended badly, glared at Valerie, almost emotionless. "What?" the woman replied to Valerie. "My check. That's my check in front of you on the desk there," said Valerie. Nancy didn't even look down at the desk. She continued to glare at Valerie. "It's 4 p.m. and I got a date tonight. We are closed," said Nancy as she grabbed her employee tag, which hung from a strap on her chest, and threw it at the window. She then slammed down the window in front of her and walked away. Well, Valerie could see her walk away through the glass of the other desks, whose employees never closed their cubicles tall. Valerie's mouth hung open in shock as she watched the woman stop and talk to other employees, laughing with them as if she didn't have a care or a rush in the world. "Bitch," Valerie said. Looking back toward the glass, Valerie noticed a small piece of the strap, which was attached to the employee badge Nancy had flung toward her. It would have hit Valerie had it not been for the glass. The small piece of strap was accessible to Valerie, but she had no intention of attempting to pull on it. She would, however, take a piece of it. Putting her hand into her purse, she slowly pulled out a small pair of scissors she would trim her eyebrows with normally. She leaned down and cut a piece of the strap, a small, square-shaped piece, and put it in her purse. Valerie turned around, her ankles sore from age, and walked toward the door. A security guard, noticing her, walked toward the glass door to open it for Valerie to exit, the door being locked around 3:50 each day to slow the speed of those who'd seek to enter so close to closing time. "I'll let you out here, ma'am," said the man. "Thank you," she replied. The security guard opened the door for her. "Thank you," she said again. Valerie looked back toward the desk she had just stood in front of. Small smile came upon her face. "Enjoy your dinner," Valerie said to herself. The security guard had a somewhat unsure look upon his face, not sure if the words were meant for him or just the ramblings of an old lady. Valerie looked up at him, smiled, and turned away to walk back to the bus station where she had been dropped off at. Chapter 2.
"What has happened to my husband?"
screamed Estelle Paulino.
"He was fine yesterday. He was working all day, and then this morning he just isn't moving, won't speak, and stares at the ceiling as if it's not even there, as if he's looking right through the ceiling at something that isn't there."
Estelle Paulino stood in the emergency room talking to Dr. Mark Castillo, a neurosurgeon brought in to assess her husband's situation. Her husband, Andrew Paulino, has been working in construction for more than 20 years. Looking like Dan Haggerty from the Grizzly Adams series, he was a man with a strong build and appeared the pinnacle of good health. The hospital, Memorial Health, had a brain trauma unit, and Andrew had spent the last 8 hours having various MRIs and other brain scans and x-rays.
"Well, he's been in there for fucking hours, and I want to see him! What is happening to him?"
said Estelle.
"I know you're upset, but the language isn't going to help, and we've got kids in this waiting room. I'm trying to help you, but behaving like this isn't going to help anything. All I can tell you is that we have a specialist coming in from Boston. Every single test we've conducted has shown that your husband has absolutely nothing wrong with him that modern science, at least what we have before us, can explain. All of our machines are telling us that he's okay, and that's good news," said Dr. Castillo.
Estelle just shook her head and looked at the floor.
"I'm getting more response from a plant I just watered at my house than I am my husband. And you're here telling me that he's just fine and that he's just having some episode. Something is wrong with my husband, that there's got to be something that we can do to figure out what the hell is going on,"
said Estelle. Dr. Castillo approached Estelle and put his arm on her shoulder.
"Listen, this doctor is one of the best neurosurgeons in the world. He's coming in on his own dime for this. He's just like me. He doesn't understand this case any more than you do. But he's coming in, and he's going to observe your husband. His vitals are fine. He's not going anywhere. You need to go home, get some rest, and we'll call you as soon as we know something. This specialist won't even arrive for another 6 hours. So you can sit here in the waiting room watching Maury Povich for the next 6 hours, or go home. Take care of your life there, and we'll reach out to you as soon as we know something. That's the best thing I can tell you right now," said Dr. Castillo. Estelle just shook her head. "Something happened to him. I don't get it. We were sitting up in bed watching TV. Everything was just fine. He gave me a kiss, and I kept watching West Wing. Well, he just went to sleep. He even woke up and went and got something to drink," she said. "What did he drink? Do you remember what he got up to drink?" said Dr. Castillo. Water from the Arrowhead container, the same container I had drank a glass out of myself before I went to bed," said Estelle, growing even more agitated. Dr. Castillo was running out of things to say to Estelle. He just didn't know what was wrong with her husband. There was nothing he could tell her that was going to make her feel any better. He had come to the point where he just wanted to tell her something, anything to get her out of there so he could go tend to her husband. "Listen, I'd like you to bring that jug of water back to the hospital when I call you to come back, once the specialist is here. Don't drink any of that water, but bring it back when you return and we can run some tests on it," said Dr. Castillo. "You want to run tests on spring water? I drank it and I'm fine," she replied. "Everyone is different, Mrs. Paulino. Our bodies are all different. I suggest you just not drink any of what remains in the jug and bring it back to the hospital when I call you to return," he said. Estelle seemed stressed, but somehow happy to be given some direction, any direction that might lead to what was happening to her husband. "Okay," she said. "I'll bring it back with me." The doctor himself knew full well that the water Mr. and Mrs. Paulino drank the night before had absolutely nothing to do with the condition of Estelle's husband. But he had to do something to get her out of there, and nothing else seemed to be working to get her out of the hospital. "Well, I'll wait for your call. You take care of him, Doc. He's all I've got," she said. It was a sentence the doctor had come to hear from grieving relatives practically on a daily basis, and yet it was his job to bring a sort of individuality to the response, to make it appear as though the concern was unique to that patient. "He's not going to die, is he?" said Estelle as she began to turn around towards the exit door. Other people waiting in the waiting room pretended not to hear the question, though they could clearly hear her. People who didn't even know her husband all seemed interested in the answer. "We're going to keep testing him. We've got one of the most prominent neurosurgeons in the world on a plane coming to see him. Things like this happen, and people just snap out of it. I can't tell you what you want to hear, but we are doing the very best that we can do. If there's something that can be done, this guy out of Boston is the one who can give us a real observation. We can just do the best we can do," said Dr. Castillo. Estelle reached for a few more words, but had none. She turned around and exited the hospital. The doctor immediately turned back towards the doors where his patient lay. He was trying to solve a puzzle named Andrew Paulino. He stood over the man who looked in perfect physical condition. "What's your story, Andrew?" the doctor said in a whisper to himself. Chapter 3. Claire DiStefano was recently named the director of the Centers for Disease Control. Stacked on her desk were literally hundreds of files, stacks of letters and DVDs sent to her from practically every governmental agency with an initial, and even a few she herself had never heard of. Martin Craig, her newly appointed assistant, introduced himself the day before. The two had dinner in Atlanta at a coffee shop as Martin explained to her what she had just gotten herself into. It wasn't an easy job, and was one of the most magnified positions. "All eyes are on you, Claire," said Martin. "Have a seat. What's up?" said Claire. "I got a call this morning from Savannah. Seems to be there are a few patients there that are almost comatose, but with no physical issues or anything that would lead anyone to believe there's anything wrong with them," replied Martin. "A poison of some kind?" Claire replied. "Nope. They have tested these people for everything, and there's just nothing there. No abnormalities, no drugs in their systems. Some just collapsed in the middle of watching their kids playing baseball at the park. One guy just didn't wake up. At least not consciously, though. His eyes were wide open. Not really sure what is the issue, but they are up to 11 people in Savannah, all at the same hospital. And we've got a few specialists on the way to see what's happening, but so far they just appear to be in a zombie-like state. Vitals are all normal, just not moving, not blinking, nothing, he said.
Claire just sat there and looked at her desk.
Do I have a file on this?
She asked Martin.
No, just bringing this into you now. What's puzzling to me is this guy who has an acute case of multiple sclerosis. That's the diagnosis. He is completely unable to talk, move, walk, and everyone we've had look at him says the condition is of someone who had the condition for 10 years or more, said Martin.
Claire stood up and walked over to her coffee machine.
Do you want a cup? She asked.
No thanks, I'm wired enough, he replied. Claire walked back over to her chair and sat down, opening the file handed to her by Martin. She flipped through the various pages.
Okay, well, the guy has MS, appears to have had it for 10 years. That all sounds pretty normal to the condition for someone who's had it for this long. I don't see anything out of the ordinary in this. Not sure why it's even in this file, Claire replied. Well, Claire, the problem is this particular case doesn't make any sense at all. He hasn't had this condition for 10 years, despite doctors that have reviewed the case, Martin replied. MS affects different people in different ways. It can be a couple of years or decades before it really has an impact on the patient, said Claire. I'm not seeing the odd connection here.
Martin opened up his briefcase and pulled out a photo of the man Jacob Santoro, age 45, in the condition he was currently in. Claire looked at the photo and leaned back in her chair.
Oh, poor bastard,
she said as she looked at the mangled physical appearance.
That's a photo from this morning. We took it at the Memorial Hospital when we were looking at other patients, said Martin. Okay, I'm understanding. He's a 45-year-old male with MS. Clearly, he's suffered from it for quite some time, said Claire.
Martin again reached into his bag, this time pulling out the sports section of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He handed it to Claire.
This is the sports section. Take a look at this photo, said Martin.
The headline read, Jacob Santoro wins golf championship for third straight year.
This is the same guy, said Claire. Take a look at the date on that newspaper, said Martin.
It was dated the day before.
Wait, this can't be right. This is the same guy? And yesterday he won a golf tournament? Said Claire.
Martin didn't know quite what to say and just nodded.
This can't be real, said Claire.
Martin stood up and walked toward the coffee machine.
Perhaps I'll have a cup after all, he said.
Claire stood up and walked over to Martin.
Is this for real? This guy in this photo was winning a golf championship in Atlanta just yesterday? Said Claire. Well, it was an amateur contest, but yeah, that's him. Same guy. The guy who won that tournament the very next day suddenly has MS like he caught a flu, said Martin.
Claire walked over to her desk and got on the phone.
It's time we took a trip to Savannah. Let's see what the hell is going on there. I want a quarantine team on standby as well, said Claire. Of course, Claire. I'm on it, and we can leave whenever you're ready, said Martin.
Martin began to walk out of the office.
Martin, I'm ready to go right now. We're leaving now.
Martin nodded and began preparations for the trip to Savannah. Chapter 4. Brady Lavoie sat at his desk in the back row next to the window at South Effingham High School in Mrs. Welch's classroom. He looked out at the parking lot while the rest of the class listened to Welch discuss history. On this particular day, the students were talking about current events, namely the 2016 election. Donald J. Trump, the New York billionaire who became the front-runner of the Republican Party, was the topic of the classroom that normally spoke of the days of Lincoln and the beginning of the Republic. Brady was lost to the topic. He was more focused on a man that was leaning up against a tree, wearing what appeared to be a top hat, in the parking lot of the school.
"Brady,"
said Mrs. Welch. Brady was oblivious to the teacher as she noticed he was apparently fixated on something outside the school window. She put a finger to her mouth and a gesture to the rest of the classroom to remain quiet as she approached Brady. Slowly, Mrs. Welch approached Brady as she was about ready to give him some teacher-student hell, when she too looked towards what Brady seemed to be glued to, and she too saw the man standing next to the tree with a top hat on. "Who is that?" Mrs. Welch said to Brady, diverting her own attention from that of a teacher ready to send the student to the principal's office to now being curious about this strange man that just stared up toward the classroom. Other students who anticipated some action between the teacher and student were now all suddenly curious as to who Mrs. Welch and Brady were now looking at. One by one, the students all stood up and walked toward the window. And one by one, each student also saw the man in the top hat as he leaned up against the tree.
"I don't know. He's been staring at me for the last 10 minutes, and I can't really make out his face," replied Brady.
One of the students, Kevin Potts, an African-American basketball player for the high school team, leaned in between both Mrs. Welch and Brady.
"Do you want me to go down there and see who he is?" said Kevin. "No, I want you to stay, all of you to stay, right here in this classroom," said Mrs. Welch. "I am going to have security check this out."
Mrs. Welch walked over to a telephone that hung up next to the classroom door. "Do you know that guy?" Kevin said to Brady.
"No, dude, he has a cartoon hat on," said Brady. "That's a top hat, fool," laughed Kevin. "That guy must think it's the year 1925 out there."
Mrs. Welch walked back towards the students. The man with the top hat just stood there.
"School security is going to talk to whomever that is," said Mrs. Welch. "We all need to get back to our prior discussion."
The entire classroom looked at Mrs. Welch as if she were from another planet. There was no way the kids were going to sit back down until they see what the man in the top hat's reaction was going to be to the approaching school security personnel.
"Okay, well, we can watch for a few minutes, I guess,"
said Mrs. Welch, replying to the students' glares. The sound of the school doors outside could be heard opening from beneath the classroom. 3 security guards at the door discussing with each other their intentions. The man with the top hat just stood there, his long coat now exposed as he slightly moved into the sunlight.
"He's got a black coat on," said Brady. "Creepy."
Mrs. Welch looked at Brady with a look of concern. The other students had various expressions on their faces. The girls seemed more concerned, and the young men were a mix of confusion to grins, as though they were watching what might be the result of a boxing match.
"Do you have any idea why this man was just staring up at you?" said Kevin.
"I already said no, I don't know who that is, but I can't see his face either," said Brady.
The security guards slowly walked toward the man in this top hat. They didn't know what they were getting into or who they were approaching. Did the man have a weapon? A police car could be seen approaching the parking lot from the main street, and the 3 security guards felt a little more emboldened to approach the man with the top hat at a faster pace.
"Hey, buddy,"
said one of the officers. There was no reply by the man who stood next to the tree. The police car pulled into the parking lot, and the man just stood there.
"Holy shit," said Mrs. Welch. "Oh, I'm sorry, kids."
She continued as she said what she thought in error. 2 officers both exited the vehicle. Now combined 5 officers slowly walked toward the man who didn't move as they said.
"Buddy," said one of the officers who stepped out of the vehicle, "you're on private property."
All 5 men closed in on the man. One of the officers slowly began to unclick his gun holster.
"What's your name, man?"
said a school security officer. The man who was just hanging out next to the tree was now the cause of both intensity and concern by all of the officers and the teacher and student who watched from their classroom. Mrs. Welch didn't know what was going on, but she also knew that protecting the students was her number one concern. If this crazed man in the top hat had a gun, she didn't want an unintentional flying bullet heading towards her classroom.
"I want everybody to step away from this window," she said.
This seemed to be something the rest of the class was now ready to do, and that was listen to Mrs. Welch. Although Brady just sat there, all of the students looked down towards the parking lot, but now from a position a few feet away from the window.
"If he moves, I want everyone to get under their desk,"
she said to her students.
"Sir, do you want to go to jail today?"
said one of the officers. The estranged man with the top hat walked 3 steps in front of the oak tree. His face looked gray. The 3 school security guards appeared to back up.
"What the fuck?"
A security guard could be heard mumbling to himself. At this sentence, the man with the top hat vanished into thin air. The entire classroom leapt back, some falling over their desks. The officers also jumped back, one falling to the ground. There was no explanation for the man in the top hat who simply disappeared before their eyes. But all eyes saw him disappear. Chapter 5. It almost seemed like stingrays on Tybee Island was a million miles away from the Social Security office that Nancy Carter was all too happy not to have to deal with until tomorrow. Her dinner date, who she met online, described himself as 6'3", 210 pounds, with dark hair and blue eyes. Nancy was ecstatic to meet her Dylan McDermott, imaginary vision in terms of expectations. When Hank Aaron showed up, the 5'7" overweight country boy walked in and gave Nancy a nod, just to make sure it was her. Nancy smirked a smile as her expectations of Dylan McDermott walking in dissolved. "Oh, this fucker better be at least rich," Nancy said under her breath. "Hey, girl, what's up? Nice to meet you." "Damn, you're a fine MILF," said Hank. Nancy was in shock, but it was a free meal, so she figured she'd get through the dinner. "On the phone you said you looked like Dylan McDermott," said Nancy. Hank, now sitting across from the table, reserved for two, smiled. "Oh, baby, I meant I acted like him. You know, like his personality. I have Dylan McDermott's personality, like in The Line of Fire, that movie with Clint Eastwood. I'm like that guy." Nancy just shook her head as the waiter walked over to the table. "Would you like a wine list?" said the male waiter. Nancy didn't flinch. "I'd like a Long Island iced tea, please," replied Nancy. "Damn, getting down fast," said Hank. "I'm getting something," she said, looking down at her purse. Your nose," she said. Hank seemed perplexed. "What about he said as he touched his face. Attempting to wipe it, it became a long, almost string cheese-length booger that never seemed to end. "Here, take this to wipe that thing," said Nancy with a disgusting look as she handed him a napkin. The waitress returned with Nancy's Long Island tea. Nancy downed it like a shot. Hank appeared to regain his composure. "Well, damn, if that wasn't the nastiest thing to ever come out of my head," said Hank. Nancy just nodded her head, trying to pretend that didn't just happen. "So what do you do for a living besides act like Dylan McDermott?" said Nancy, not amused. "Well, I'm a golf instructor here at a country club. I always loved playing golf, so that's been my life. I used to work at an oil well, but that job just got old," replied Hank. Nancy nodded her head again. The waitress approached with a menu. "Would you both like to hear the specials before I give you the menu?" said the waitress. Nancy wasn't going to order anything involving cheese. "Sure, go ahead," said Nancy. "We have filet mignon with broccoli, and a wonderful chestnut sauce with cranberries, a delicious mahi-mahi, and our Valerie chicken with green peas, and our in-house country sauce is to die for," the waitress said. Nancy just sat there, and the only visual in her head was the nastiness she just saw come out of her blind date's nose. At that moment, she actually wished she were blind. "No, I'm really not thinking I'm very hungry. This guy," Nancy said as she was pointing at Hank, "is the blind date from hello. I can already tell he probably can't keep a damn job, talking damn like he's in the hood. I've had a couple of rides at the rodeo, Christopher, and you are one ride I will never take," she said as the waitress stood standing. The manager, Mark Wilson, of the restaurant, walked over to the table. "Is everything all right over here, Mr. Arnold?" the manager said. "Wait, you know this loser?" Nancy said to the manager. "This loser, ma'am, owns Georgia Oil and Gas and the country club here in town, and it's time for you to leave," said the manager. Nancy's face turned 50 shades of something. It was a peculiar expression of shock, embarrassment, how do I undo this, and ultimately, defeat. Hank stood up. "Just put this disaster on my tab, Mark. I'll go be a loser somewhere else," replied Hank. "But, sir, you don't have a tab. You own this restaurant," replied Mark. Hank looked at Nancy and smiled. "Oh, yeah, I do." Valerie sat in her rocking chair and laughed. Chapter 6. "Dolly Parton is on tour," said Chief Marlon Frey of the Savannah Police Department. "I always liked her," he said to Officer Taylor Rye, who sat in the chair in front of his desk. Rye was a rookie with 3 days on the job. "What do you think of Dolly Parton?" said Chief Frey. "I never gave her much thought. I don't really listen to country music," replied Taylor. "Oh, you're missing out," said Marlon.
The buzz on his 1980s intercom interrupted the chief's educational exploits on country music to young Taylor. "Yes, what?" he said.
"There are some people out here to see you,"
said a female voice. "Who?" replied the chief.
"They are with the U.S. government,"
she replied.
"You should come out here, Chief."
The chief sighed. "I'm going to get you one of her CDs. No officer around here cannot know who the great Dolly Parton is," he said as he gave the rookie a small grin. The rookie nodded, a bit confused. The chief walked out of his office to see several well-dressed government-looking individuals in the back of the main office of the Savannah PD, standing behind the rows of officers and detectives. All of them looked straight at the chief as he slowly walked toward them, smiling at the officers as he walked by them. "This seems ominous," he said to himself, but loud enough for those around him to hear. A man walked up to the chief and introduced himself. "Hello, Chief Frey. My name is Dayton Rosenberg, and I'd like to introduce you to Claire DiStefano, the director of the CDC." Claire approached him and extended her hand. "Chief Marlon Frey, it's a pleasure," she said. Chief Frey looked around at the officers and then back toward the bigwigs, who apparently flew in for a special visit just to meet him. There was no call first. He hated it when people didn't call first. "Why don't we step into my office?" said the chief. Chief Frey turned around and walked back toward his office, his newfound friends about 5 feet behind him as they followed. As he walked back into his office, the song 9 to 5 played on the iPhone of Taylor Rye. "Chief, I totally know this song," he said. Get up, shut that off, go to work," he said in a rapid tone, realizing those behind him might not want to hear Dolly Parton at this particular moment. The officer walked out past the incoming visitors from the CDC. Chief Frey stood in front of his desk as they all walked in. Dayton shut the door. The chief noticed, realizing he hadn't asked him to. "Okay, so what is this all about?" said Chief Frey. "Pardon the abrasiveness of the visit, but I am an action director, not one who sits idle when I'm advised there may be a problem. The CDC has received numerous reports that there have been some people in this state suffering from an almost, and I hate to use this word, but if the shoe fits, zombie-like psychosis. They are frozen, with no real explanation as to why. There's no health issue that we can see. Scans are coming back normal, but these people are just out of it. We are here to try to put a stop to whatever might be going on before it becomes something else, to see what's going on," said Claire. "A preventive measure," Dayton inserted. "The mayor is on his way," said Claire. The chief looked more surprised that the mayor was on his way than the revelation that there were hospitals reporting zombie-like patients. "What? The mayor is on his way here?" said the chief. Claire looked at Dayton with a look of, did he not just hear what we told him, on her face? "Yes, and the president is aware of our arrival as we assess exactly what the cause of these issues are," she said. "We aren't sure whether or not this is just a virus or some sort of foul play. Some of these patients have what appear to be like pin-like lacerations." "Like a needle?" said the chief. "No, more like a crochet instrument, a crochet needle, something used for making patterns, blankets, things like that. Several of the patients have the same markings," said Dayton. "The president knows you're here?" said the chief. Claire gave Dayton that same look. The chief caught that look this time. "What can I do to help you?" said the chief, snapping out of the political star-struck moment of those who knew the director of the CDC was standing in his office. "Well, for one, I'm going to leave one of my guys here. We'd like to have you do a few NCIC searches on a list of names we're going to provide you with. We'd like to know the backgrounds of a few of these patients. We're doing our own checks from the feds, but I'd like to talk to a few of the officers myself who may have had some interactions with these people locally. We're hitting up diners, restaurants, bars of some of their known hangouts. While this could be a viral infection of some sort, there could also be something more sinister happening, and in that event we want to simply make sure we're covering all the angles," said Claire. "You think there could be someone doing this to these people?" said the chief. "Could be," said Dayton. "Right now we don't know. Similar markings, several patients, could be anything. Could be the same markings due to a viral infection. We're not pinpointing at the moment, or those markings could be the workings of someone with an axe to grind. That's why we want boots on the ground for this one. And we'll need you to make sure your officers are there to support us. Everyone is on the same playing field here. We're all investigators on this." That 1980s buzzer was going off again. "What is it?" said Chief Frey.
Officer Landon and Hamilton would like to speak with you,
said the voice.
They are very upset.
Chief Frey looked at Claire and her associates. "Upset," he said into the intercom. "Send 'em in." Claire and her associates stepped to the side of the door that led into the chief's office. Claire opened the door to the two officers. Both were sweating. "Chief," said Officer Landon, "we gotta—" The two officers were unaware that they might be interrupting something. "Can we speak to you now?" said Officer Landon. "Oh, do you mean is this a bad time?" replied the chief as he gestured toward Claire. Chief Frey just stared at the officers who had no intention of leaving the office. "You guys look like you just seen a ghost," said Claire with a faint smile. Both officers looked at Claire. "I think we just did," said Officer Hamilton.
Chapter 7. Valerie Lavoie walked through the aisle of the grocery store, pushing her empty carriage as she decided to browse from boredom. Today she'd start at the far left of the store and just look for things to buy. She was bored. The far left aisle began with breaded items and the sugary products such as cupcakes. She was almost giddy at the thought of having to do this in order to kill a few hours. She was in her 70s, and she felt as though she'd almost run out of things to do. The highlight of her life had become shopping in the grocery store, occasionally playing bingo at the local church, and watching reruns of the old Matlock episodes. Valerie felt a certain angriness. She wasn't angry at her life, she was angry at the lives of others, and how she saw people treated. She was angry at the way they treated her. She was angry at the fact that she'd had a gift that she'd never asked for and was angry at her age. She didn't want to be 77. She never expected to be 77. She felt as though she were wrapping things up at this stage of her life. She was lucky, however. She had the ability to right those wrongs using her gift, and the collection of dolls that she had acquired over the years had reached the brim of her pirate-styled chest that she'd put in the basement. Today, however, was about browsing the grocery store. She walked past the breaded items to a stack of jars that held different sorts of fudge. Chocolate fudge read one container. She lifted the jar and began to read its label. The label had countless chemicals and ingredients in it. Bunch of shit, she said to herself. She put the jar back on the rack. Strolling down the next island, she turned to the right to head toward the next aisle. On the back aisle held dairy products, but she walked by as if she hadn't even seen it. Dairy, after all, was another aisle, and she didn't want to cheat herself of the time it would take to look at everything on it. It would be cheating herself if she looked at the back aisle dairy products in between her stroll up each aisle. However, on this day there was activity in the middle of the aisle that she hoped to avoid yet, as a man in a white shirt and tie wrestled with a man clinging to his jacket.
"I saw you put that in your coat. Now give it to me. The cops are on their way, you fucking thief," he said to the man, who appeared to be like any of the numerous homeless people seen on the street. Valerie had just been given something to do today. "What on earth are you doing to that man?" she said, as she left her carriage alone while she walked towards what was actually the manager of the store. "Ma'am, this is under control. Please return to your shopping," said the manager. Valerie continued walking towards the homeless man, who turned around to look at Valerie while the manager was still sifting through his clothes. "I didn't do nothing," said the homeless man, who was a white male in his 60s, early 70s. "Can you believe this is how we are? That they made us have to do this?" said the man. "Sir," Valerie said to the manager, "I will gladly pay for whatever he has in his jacket." "This is none of your business, ma'am. We don't take kindly to shoplifters, and the sign in front of the store says clearly that if you steal, you'll be prosecuted," said the manager. "Well, he's not stealing because I just said I'd pay for it," said Valerie. Ignoring Valerie, the manager walked the man off down the aisle towards the front entrance where two police officers had pulled up. Valerie followed up the aisle, slowly limping towards the manager as he dragged the homeless man up the aisle, a man who weighed about 130 pounds to the manager's 250-pound frame. "Have you no kindness in your heart?" said Valerie to the manager, who continued to ignore Valerie as he dragged the man up. "Have you nothing else to do?" she yelled towards him, not even a glance back at her. Sickened by the display, Valerie decided that her patronage of this store was undeserved. There was no reason to physically be dragging this older gentleman up the aisle like a rag doll over what turned out to be a quart of milk. The milk fell to the floor. Valerie walked towards it and picked it up. "Milk," she said softly to herself. "He just wanted some milk and you gotta send him to jail," she screamed at him. Cops grabbed the man as if he were a terrorist, throwing him up against a register and scaring the hell out of the cashier, who stood there as customers sought to purchase their items. The manager smiled. Valerie approached him, grabbed her purse, and whacked the manager with it. Startled, he turned towards her. "What the fuck, lady? You want to go to jail too?" the manager screamed at her. "At our age, we're already in jail. Pieces of garbage like you just rub it in," she said. The man didn't quite know how to respond to the 77-year-old. Officers did not overhear her as they wrestled the man out of the store as if he has secrets to the Kennedy assassination. "All that man wanted was milk," she said. "I said I'd pay for it. You dragged him up the aisle, an old man, for what? You've done had him sent to jail because he wanted some milk." "Well, in jail they have free milk. I did him a favor," he replied. "And you did me one too," she screamed. "Really, bitch? And what exactly have I done for you?" he asked as Valerie walked toward the entrance of the store. "You gave me something to do other than shop in this store." Chapter 8. "I don't want you going near your grandmother," said Tina Lavoie. "She's out of her mind." "But she's your mom, Mom. How can you tell me not to talk to her? She may be the only person who can explain what happened at school," replied Brady Lavoie. Sitting in the kitchen of the home he shared with his mother, Brady had tried to make sense of what he'd seen at school. A man had disappeared in front of his entire classroom, high school security personnel, and the police. Everybody'd seen it. "It was probably just a crackhead," said Tina. Tina had raised her son with her mother Valerie, although she had been distancing her son from his grandmother in her later years. After having Brady and never getting the opportunity to marry his father, who had died in Iraq, his grandmother had become a big influence. That wasn't exactly something Tina had wanted. Brady looked at the plate of his food before him as he was readying for school, while Tina sat in the living room on her cell phone. Tina poked her head through the doorway, noticing Brady wasn't touching his food. She mouthed the word, "Eat." Brady snapped out of his stare at the hash browns and runny eggs. "You broke the yolk," he whispered back. For some reason, Brady couldn't eat the eggs if the yolks were broken, instead cutting the white portions of it only. If the yolk got on the egg whites, that was the end of it. He wouldn't eat any of it. "That was your school. They canceled it today. Something about what happened yesterday," she said. "What exactly happened?" Brady stood up and walked to the sink with his plate. "You didn't eat your eggs," she said. "That's because you broke the yolk," he said again. "What happened in school?" she asked again. Brady walked back to the table and sat down. "I was sitting at my desk looking out the window. A man was standing next to the tree. The teacher came over to me to see what I was looking at. The class then all stood up, saw the guy, cops came, and the man just vanished into thin air in front of everybody," he replied. "I've told you this, but you didn't believe me, or you weren't listening to what I said." Tina walked over to the table and sat down across from her son. "What you're saying doesn't make any sense," she said. "It obviously isn't making sense to the school if they're canceling the classes. I'm not making any of this up. You can ask the teacher what she saw, the police officers. You can ask the kids, everyone who saw what I did," he said. The eggs looked gross. "I want to make more eggs. You broke the yolk," he said. Tina looked irritated and stood up. She walked over to Brady and grabbed the plate. "You're such a pain in the ass. What do you think happens to the eggs when you eat 'em?" she said. Brady smiled. I don't see what happens to them, that's the point, he said. Tina walked over to the stove and cracked a few new eggs open. This time she'd be more careful not to break the yolks. You're so funny, she said. I know, he said. Tina fried up a few of the eggs and walked them back over to her son. Maybe I'll talk to my mother about this. I just know that if I do, I'll have to listen to every conspiracy in the book, she said. Brady looked at his mom as he began to use his fork to eat the whites of his eggs. Mom, maybe you should consider whether or not she's talking about conspiracies or not. Maybe she's smarter than you think, he said. Tina walked towards the door, readying for work. Just eat your damn eggs, smartass. Chapter 9. I love this, said Valerie as she stood in the aisle at the Ben Franklin store. The store was a hobby shop that sold various fabrics and car models for the enthusiast. I wish I had time to do all the things in this store. It's hard to believe there's an actual store like this, that people have this kind of time. I walk out the door and everyone seems so busy, she said to a stocking clerk who was pretending to listen. Can you reach up there and grab that for me? She said to the clerk. What Valerie wanted was a fabric that had a series of numbers all over it. It was a sheet of cloth that, say, someone could make a doll out of, if they wanted to. It was covered in numbers, all color green. Green signifies money, she said. The clerk just smiled and did his job, handing her the sheet. $5.99, she said. What a nice piece of fabric. Walking out of the mall, she walked towards the Verizon and had thoughts of paying her bill until she saw the line of people. That place is always full, she said to herself, opting to continue walking through the mall. Walking by a Radio Shack, she saw the TV screens all on the same channel. There seems to be a woman on the TV standing in front of a hospital, but she was unable to make out what she was saying. Curious, she walked into the store and on her own adjusted the volume of one of the TVs. That's just for show, ma'am. You're really not supposed to touch that, said a young black male who worked at the store. I just wanted to hear what she was saying. It's low. No one else can hear it, she said. Well, just for a few minutes, please. I could get in trouble if anyone's messing around with the TV, he replied. Don't worry, I won't get you into any trouble, she said. The woman on the TV was a female Savannah officer standing next to a doctor. There were a few people behind them that looked pretty official-looking. The woman spoke. So in short, we're asking the public to please contact us by calling 911 if you have any information about these cases. The CDC is now on the site, and we're looking into what the cause of the cases are. At this point, we have several individuals whom have been admitted, and we have no cause for what's happening at this point, she said. A reporter injected. Could this be food poisoning of some sort? Something undiagnosed? He asked. The woman shook her head. To be honest, we've checked these patients for absolutely everything we can think of, even things we've never heard of until the CDC got here, and there's nothing on the books that can explain what the cause of these conditions are. We are just totally at a loss, and we are doing our best. We've checked pharmacies, medications, rare diseases that have never crossed into the U.S. territory, and we really are coming up with absolutely nothing. That's why I'm standing out here with all of you to try to figure this out with the public's help, she said. Is the president aware of this? Said a female reporter's voice, though she could not be seen through the crowd of people. Yes, the president is aware. The CDC would not be here without his authorization. But the DEA, FBI, and state police are also combing the city to try to find the cause of these ill folks. But my friends, that's really all I have for you right now. As far as we know, these instances are only occurring in Savannah, no other states, and we've been in touch with them all. None have any reported cases of these types of illnesses. That'll be all for now. We will tell you all more when we have something else to explain, she said. Looking at the doctor, the officer gave her the option of speaking. Anything you'd like to add? She said to the doctor. No, you've covered it, she said. Voices of reporters continued to ask questions as both walked away from the podium, and it was good timing as the Radio Shack clerk approached Valerie. I'm sorry, ma'am. My manager says I need to change the channel to something more cheerful. These kinds of stores tend to make the customers pass by, he said. Valerie just smiled. Oh, I completely understand. I was just browsing around the mall anyway. Thank you for letting me watch, she said as she smiled and walked away. Valerie walked through the mall in deep thought, but she also had knowledge. She knew the cause of these medical conditions. The CDC, the FBI, the state police, hell, the Secret Service. None of them would be able to explain what the cause of these ill people were, and frankly, none of them would ever believe that these particular patients all had a certain condition that no one had ever heard of before. A condition called pissing off a woman named Valerie. Chapter 10. Claire DiStefano sat alone in the office of Hospital Administrator Paul Logan's office at Memorial Health of Savannah. Combing through the files of the patients that were stacked in front of her, she aimed to find some sort of clue or a connection to the patients that could somehow explain what was happening in Savannah. Dr. Logan walked into the office with a cell phone in hand. "I'm sorry, it's a zoo out there," he said. "That's fine, I understand," she replied. Paul grabbed a chair and pulled it next to Claire's as he looked at the stack of files before him. "Wow, when you look at 'em like that," he said. Claire shook her head. "Okay, well, so far I am finding nothing that connects any of these people to any one theme or person or activity. The only thing that I'm finding is that none of them are the elderly. All of these people are between 30 and 65, and that's about as far as I've got," she said. Paul grabbed a few of the files and put them on his lap. "Victor Rafinsky, 54, runs a pharmacy here in town. Every single patient is from Savannah, and every one of the cases we've seen come in here are patients from Savannah," he said. "Yes, and there isn't a case anywhere in the United States that is in any way similar to what we have here," she said. "FBI is en route because that alone is cause for the belief that there is a criminal element. We don't have one single patient from anywhere on the outskirts. It's all right here," she said. "So what do you think we're looking for?" said the doctor. Claire took a deep breath, exhaling as deeply. She stood up from her chair and walked around the office in deep thought as Paul sat in the chair and just watched her. "You're looking for a medical solution. Me? I'm looking for someone very smart. Maybe a chemist, someone with a knowledge of medicine, something biochemical. It could be military, someone with a knowledge of infectious diseases. It's not simply some nut with a local axe to grind, or we would have found something by now," she said. "We've got the FBI looking at public footage in any area where one of these patients may have collapsed. There are a lot of board agents going back years." "Not a job I'd want," he said. Paul continued to review the various files that Claire had been combing through. "These wounds on the victims coming in, they aren't exterior. They all seem to be coming from the inside out. And they have that edge, that hook shape. I've never seen anything like this before. Nothing seems to heal the wounds. Some of these patients have simple wounds, but enough to put them in here. Some of them are just completely out of it. Symptoms seem to be that of one of those brown recluse spider bites," said Paul. Claire sat back down. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean the response the physical body is having. With a brown recluse spider bite, people would have this reaction to it that ranged from flu-like to just being completely unconscious. These are not bites, but the wounds are extremely painful to these patients. We've tried to induce a coma on a few of them, but brain activity suggests they are feeling everything we do, as if they were awake. I've never seen that before. Not like this," he said. "We put these people in that state for a reason, but these wounds seem to be causing a reaction to the patients, regardless of whether we utilize any anesthesia of any kind. The patient seems to not only be feeling this pain while conscious, but also while unconscious." Claire looked at the photos that Paul was flipping through. "So, we have either an extremely rare disease that is stemming from something in Savannah, or a brilliant psycho that has made sure no matter what we do, there is no antidote to their suffering," she replied. "Yes," replied Paul. "This person would have to really hate someone, though, because this is beyond the pale." The door had a small knock as it opened, and standing behind it was Ruthie Carter, a special agent with the FBI.
As a chemical hazard response unit member, she was often assigned to what appeared to be medical cases and turned out to be criminal. "Hello," she said. "Come on in," said Paul as he stood up to shake her hand. Claire also stood up then, settling for a mutual smile rather than the handshake formalities. "I'm," Claire said before being interrupted. "I know who you are," said Ruthie. A silence came upon the room. Claire looked around the room, then back at Ruth. "Well, thoughts?" said Claire. "Is there somewhere I can sit?" said Ruthie. Paul slid over the chair that he'd been sitting on. Ruthie smiled as she sat down. Paul walked over to his desk and leaned upon it. "I have looked at what Dr. Logan sent over, and we've got people analyzing tissues as we speak. Preliminary results have shown us that everything about these patients is normal. They are in fine health, and there's nothing showing up on anything we've done, from x-rays to our lab, which is pretty sophisticated, and I'd like to say has the largest staff of nerds you've ever seen. One of the shared opinions is that this could be a manifestation of something psychological, a mass hysteria of sorts. The report about the high school suggests a sort of common trance, but we're trying to determine how that might be possible," said Ruthie. Claire looked bewildered by the statement. "I'm almost speechless. Psychological?" said Claire. "I can't see it," said Paul. "Well, that's why we are coming to this being the byproduct of something in their minds. We can't see any reason behind any of the physical wounds on any of these patients. Everyone is stumped," said Ruthie. Claire was growing even more frustrated by Ruthie's assessment. "So what you're telling me is we have nothing," she said. Claire dialed a number on her cell phone, seeming to completely detach from those in the room as she became increasingly agitated, as well as challenged by where things stood, which was nowhere close to an answer. "It's Claire. Where are we on the video of where the victims were found?" she said. Paul walked over to Ruthie. "Victims," Paul whispered. Chapter 11. Valerie sat at a small desk in her basement, a small shoebox on top of it. To the right of the shoebox was a yellow legal pad with various scribbles she'd made. A list of names provided her with those who may have irritated her or, in her mind, done her wrong. The things that may have caused Valerie to be upset ranged from a person who walked too slowly in front of her while they carried on a long conversation on their cell phone as she attempted to reach the ladies' room, to people carrying on conversations at cash registers. Her tolerance had become less and less, as her abilities with her dolls were once something she rarely would approach. However, as she got older and the world became more annoying to a woman her age, she was spending more and more time in the basement. She'd felt a distance from her daughter for some time now, and often thought about her grandson. As agitated as she was at her daughter for not providing easier access to him, she understood why. Besides, she never used her powers towards her family, no matter how much they irritated her. Valerie had first discovered her ability with voodoo as a child. Her mother, Cynthia, had told her stories about old Savannah. Valerie had never gave it much credence until her mother showed her those abilities. When Valerie was younger, her father had died of brain cancer before she'd reached 7 years old. It wasn't until Valerie was a senior in high school that her mother finally dated a man, a local grocer, named Arthur Baker. During the relationship, Cynthia had discovered that her boyfriend was compelled to spend nights with other female companions. Using his clothing and hair, Valerie witnessed her mother manipulate what appeared to be a small doll. It appeared to look quite similar to Arthur, and Valerie knew that this was no mistake. It was Cynthia's first acknowledgment of her own gift in exposing it to Valerie. Arthur disappeared shortly thereafter, and although Cynthia took the credit with a smile, Valerie had simply believed that Arthur had simply left. No one had ever heard from him again. Upon Cynthia's passing in 1975 of a heart attack, Valerie had discovered many diaries and notebooks, along with this shoebox that was now before her. While Valerie had never exposed her own daughter to her abilities, she'd witnessed her mother in that basement on numerous occasions, sitting much like she was now. She never asked questions about the weird feelings she would get when she would see Valerie in the basement. When Valerie's daughter had her own baby, it was simply a topic she never brought up to her son. Rather, she would simply minimize the time they spent together. Opening the box before her, there appeared to be about 30 small dolls, all with pins inside them and various scraps of clothing, a few with hair. She had collected the dolls over the years. Some of the dolls represented the living who lived in a sort of suspended animation during their life because they'd rubbed her the wrong way, while a few of the people had died. Even after her death, she'd never released them from the consequences of what they'd done to her while they'd been alive, despite having no realization of what sort of purgatory they may be held in. She also didn't care. Time had made her stonier. At 77, she knew that her days were numbered. Valerie seemed oblivious to the fact that the U.S. government was seizing upon Savannah due to her actions. She didn't know if they'd figure her out, but she also didn't care. "Look at all of you," she said to the dolls. "All of you deserve what you've received." She focused in on one doll, lifting it from the shoebox. "Roger, Roger, I remember you. You used to beat your wife, but she left you and now is married to one of them millionaires in the Hamptons," she said to the doll. She was about to put the dolls back into the shoebox when she stopped herself, lifting the doll back from the shoebox. "Maybe you've suffered long enough," she said as she pulled one of the pins from the man's chest. 2 remained in the shoulder and knee. "But maybe you should suffer a little bit, for a little bit more," she said as she put the doll back into the box with the remaining 2 pins in the doll. She looked through the other dolls. "Oh, you," she said to a doll. "You killed that man in the park. You are right where you belong," she said as she put the doll back, a doll that had about 20 pins about its body. "And you," she said. "Oh, I remember you. Whatever came of you, Mrs. Handley, for increasing your husband's life insurance policy and poisoning him? I wonder how your life is for you now," she said. She knew that their conditions in life were as she had dictated. Life passing each person by while Valerie controlled their destiny in a small shoebox. "I do the world a favor by putting you in here. I am not a judge, nor am I a jury. I speak for those without a voice. And your life belongs in this shoebox so that you can hurt no one else," she said. Valerie stood up from her desk and turned towards the stairs, and slowly began the climb up the stairs. It would likely take her about 15 minutes to get back up. Her knees had shown time, her balance offset by age. Her mind, however, still sharp, but focused on her irritation with the world. As she reached the top of the stairs, she heard her doorbell ring. "Who is there?" she said. "I'm almost at the top of the stairs. Just hang on," she said. She could hear that the door had opened. "Who the hell walked into my house?" she screamed, as she was 2 stairs from the top of her stairs. "It's Brady. It's your grandson," the voice yelled as she approached the stairs. "Let me help you, Grandma," he said. "You should never be walking up these stairs by yourself or down them. What are you thinking, Grandma?" Valerie smiled as wide as she could at the beauty of her grandson and the beauty of him genuinely worried about her. "Oh, Brady, my beautiful grandson, worrying about me. How are you, honey? Where's your mother?" she said excitedly. "Oh, you know, she's working all the time," he replied. "Well, come on into the living room and let me make you something to eat. Have you eaten?" she said. "No, that'd be great, but I don't want you to put yourself out," he replied. "Put me out? Don't be silly. Come on in here and let's sit down. I am so happy to see you. You have no idea," she said as she slowly closed the door to the basement below. As the door closed, Brady could have sworn he heard the sounds of many voices coming from the basement. Only they weren't just voices. They appeared to almost be screams. "Is everything all right?" she said to Brady. Brady looked a little perplexed. Maybe he'd just been hearing things, or things his mother told her had made him a bit paranoid. "I'm good, Grandma. I'm really good. I just wanted to come over here and see how you were," he said. "Well, let's have some food and I'll fill ye in," she said with enthusiasm. His grandmother walked toward the kitchen as he stood in the hallway looking back at the door to the basement. Valerie noticed. "Brady, come on in the kitchen now. Don't be staring at that door, and don't you ever go down there anyway. You hear?" "Let's eat," she said. Brady listened to his grandmother, and into the kitchen he went. Chapter 12. Officers from the high school sat in the commissary with Detective Scott Winger. Scott, with his head in his hands, rubbing his eyes. It had been a long day. He'd been to the hospital, taken statements from family members, fielded FBI phone calls about any updates, had the CDC providing him with various to-do lists, and the Attorney General called on the hour. The medical aspects of what was occurring in Savannah made little sense, but sitting here listening to officers talk about a disappearing man in a top hat, that seemed over the top. "All right, guys, so listen," he said, removing his hands from his eyes. "What you're telling me, and from the statements you've obtained from Mrs. Welch and these kids in her classroom, is that this guy just appeared and disappeared in the parking lot." Officer Carlton Lynn hesitated to respond, but did so. "Believe me, I don't want to be here talking about this hocus-pocus shit any more than you want to hear it, Scott. But the statements you have, those are all real. That's what happened. There isn't anything else to add, and if there weren't so many civilian witnesses who saw the same thing, we'd all be very adaptable to your redoing the report in this case, any way you see fit." "It happened," said Carlton. The detective stood up and walked over to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup. He took it black. Turning towards the officers, they awaited his response. "I don't know how to respond to this, but I've got every agency with initials climbing up my ass, and I have run out of my own logical explanations for what you gentlemen saw. I have a doctor who flew in who would like to speak with you," said Scott. "A shrink? We aren't crazy, Scott," said Carlton. "I'm not saying you are, but you saw something I can't explain, and we're paid to explain things around here. So you're all going to have to talk to this doctor. He's a psychologist who teaches at Harvard in Boston, and he's here," said the detective. Dr. Elliot Claiborne walked into the room without knocking. "Gentlemen, I think I feel my ears ringing," Dr. Claiborne said, referring to the fact that he knew he was being talked about in the room. Dr. Claiborne walked over to the coffee maker as all of the officers in the room stood up, readying for an introduction. "A waking dream," said the doctor. "One of the explanations was some sort of mass waking dream. However, in this instance, it was a collective waking dream. Now, I'm just reaching for the stars a little myself on this, but it's a waking dream theory that I have, somehow instigated by a mentalist of some sort who triggered a reaction in everyone in the classroom and in the parking lot," said the doctor. There was no response to this theory from anyone in the room. The doctor just put his head down, smirked with a faint laugh, and put his head back up to look at the officers. "What else do you got?" said Scott. "Well," began the doctor, when a commotion could be heard outside the commissary. All the officers, the detective, and the doctor walked into the hallway to see officers pointing guns at a man at the end of the hallway in the main police department office. It was the man in the top hat. "He's dressed like Abraham Lincoln. Look at his clothes," said Carlton. "What's your name?" An officer down the hallway could be heard yelling at the man. "Don't point your guns at him. Put your weapons down," said Scott. Scott just looked at the doctor. "Well, want to go say a few words to our waking dream, Doc?" said Scott. The doctor looked completely out of his element and walked towards the man in the top hat, who was now standing at the end of the hall. "What is your name, sir?" said the doctor as officers surrounded the man in the top hat. In a whisper, the man appeared to be forcing words. An officer in the background was filming the man using his iPhone. "I can't hear you, sir," said the doctor. The man in the top hat mouthed words, but no sound came from his mouth. The doctor walked up to him and attempted to put his hand on his shoulder. His hand went through the man. "What the fuck?" said the doctor, a gasp coming from the entire office of police detectives. The doctor just stared. "Who are you? What do you want?" the doctor said with fear in his voice. The man in the top hat just looked at him. "They won't let her in," the man said in a whisper. The doc looked around at everyone around him. No one seemed to understand, but everyone heard him. Who won't they let in? Let in where?" said the doctor. "They won't let her in," the man said again. And once again the man vanished out of thin air, all in the room leaping backwards. The doctor, however, who flew in from Harvard, Elliot Claiborne, just stood there. Detective Scott Winger approached Dr. Claiborne. "I'm awake," said Dr. Claiborne. Slowly, Dr. Claiborne looked at the detective, still focused on the wall where the man in the top hat had just stood before them all. "So am I," said the detective. Chapter 13. Valerie was not one who forgot about a grudge. When she first realized about her abilities to wreak havoc on those who crossed her, she was less inclined to use those gifts so easily. The older she got, the less it took to get on her bad side. The grocery store manager who gave the homeless man a hard time was about to have his day, but she would be unable to conduct her techniques without some shred of clothing that the manager might wear. Her goal was to get even, as her anger grew with each day. She had turned Savannah upside down and appeared to be oblivious to it. That wasn't how it was in her youthful days. It took something pretty bad to bring her into her basement and start carving out dolls. She was pulling the trigger quite easily these days. Walking into the grocery store, she recognized the manager right away. He was standing next to a young man he was obviously training. "So when that happens, you just swipe your card, and that will override the system and will trigger a page to the manager on duty," he said to him as he swiped the card. Valerie looked at him like a dog did a bone, and that sinister expression on her face had made it clear that something was beginning to take over. This was not the Valerie that the community had grown to know, although knowing her was more like knowing of her. She'd been seen all over Savannah, and while the dramas were unfolding at the hospital with the entire government looking for the cause of the patients who lay zombie-like, the woman who held all the answers stood in a grocery store. The manager gave her a glance, seemingly not recognizing her. Even if he had, in the incident, there had been many incidents within the store over the years, and many arguments with the customers that he'd just have to let go of as those years went by. Valerie took a sharp right as she entered the store, walking towards the produce section. She spotted a mango and picked it up. "A mango in Savannah. It has been a long time since I've had one of you," she said to herself as she put it in a small plastic bag that she pulled from one of the produce rolls. The mango would just serve as an excuse to purchase something and to hopefully get closer to the manager of the grocery store. Walking towards the register, she could see and overhear the manager of the grocery store continuing to teach the newbie how to work the register. The new employee was an 18-year-old male who just wanted to make his car payment. He was half listening to the manager and half thinking about when this day would end. As Valerie walked toward the checkout counter, a man cut in front of her. Valerie was taken aback by the man who just walked right in front of her. While he technically beat her to the punch and had yet to pass the threshold of being next in line, she felt that she was certainly close enough. How rude, she thought. The man stood there, a 6-foot-tall man in his late 60s. He didn't look very friendly, no matter what day it was. "Son of a bitch," she whispered to herself. For a moment he had taken her attention away from the grocery store manager. "I need a pack of Marlboro Reds," he said. The deep and gritty voice piqued her interest. It sounded like a voice she had heard before. As the man reached for his wallet, she caught a tattoo marking on his wrist. The sight of it froze her in her tracks.
"That is 11:27, the young man said to him.
"I've got the change," he replied. Reaching into his front pocket, he pulled out change to pay the 27 portion so as not to break another bill. Out spilled string from his pocket, which landed on the ground. Valerie was trying to process this and who the man was. She'd seen that mark before, and she knew that voice. How did she know that voice? It was in 1970 in Athens, Georgia, when she had seen 3 of her friends beaten as she strolled a dirt road. She had been walking home from work when the flames caught her eyes. A man had approached her, a sort of lookout for the activities that had been underway behind the woods, and into a Ku Klux Klan gathering that stoned 3 men, 2 of which died when Athens police had discovered the men. The man, Arnold White, approached her and asked her where she was going. "Where you going?" she remembered him asking.
"I'm going home. I live on this road," she replied.
"If you want to live, you'll keep your head down and keep on walking," he replied. The man looked in one of the bags that she'd been carrying and grabbed an apple out of her bag. "Go on, get out of here," he replied. Valerie continued walking, witnessing the men beat 3 others as she walked to her home, terrified by the meeting of domestic terrorists that had killed so many of her friends and families in the 1940s and 1950s. This was 1970, and here she was witnessing it again. Nothing had changed for black people, despite the media claiming otherwise, as peace and love had hardly covered Athens any time soon. She saw the man who had approached her walk back up the pathway grabbing a stick as he joined his cohorts in beating the 3 men. Valerie dropped her bags and ran back to her home. She never forgot that day, but the fog in her mind was suddenly becoming clear as the man before her at this grocery store brought her back in time. And in that time this man had made her drop her groceries as she ran for her life. And now he was in aisle 5 at the grocery store buying a pack of cigarettes. Valerie kneeled down to grab the lint that had fallen from his pocket while he grabbed change to pay for his cigarettes. He walked out of the store. She carefully placed the lint in her pocketbook. She then looked at the manager of the grocery store, the manager she had originally come to see that day. "This is your lucky day," she said. "Be good to the homeless." He looked at her a little confused, but then remembered Valerie's face. "I will, ma'am. I'm sorry," he said. "Good," she replied. "Good for you." For some reason, the grocery store manager believed her. He nodded his head in agreement. Chapter 14. Combing through the thousands of pictures that came to the FBI from the security cameras from the locations where hospital patients collapsed had become a very tedious situation. "I am at a loss," said Special Agent Dal Richards, a 33-year-old agent in computer crimes, ordinarily, but who used his skills to comb through the footage using facial recognition software. A special agent, Cynthia Bork, looked over his shoulder. Also 33, her main office was located in Atlanta. Dal had flown in from Washington Bureau of the FBI. "So how do you come through all of this exactly?" said Cynthia. Dal looked at the photos, squinting. Cynthia noticed. "Are you sure you don't need glasses?" she quipped. Slowly, Dal turned around toward her. "No, I'm good," he replied. Cynthia just stood and looked at the pictures on the computer that Dal had seemed to be squinting at. Dal seemed a little uncomfortable with having someone leaning over him and turned towards her briefly. "Pull up a chair if you'd like to look," he said. "Oh, sure, sorry," she said as she pulled a chair next to Dal's. Cynthia now squinted as well. "So what are you seeing? What is it you're looking for?" she asked. Dal exhaled a deep breath. Chaos is what this sort of is. Utter chaos. Back in the 1980s, this was done by about 10 guys combing through frame after frame,
Now we have computer software program that allows us to feed in the footage digitally, and it searches for familiar faces, one person that might be in the same place over and over again. This is a little different because we're feeding data from months, and the program has been at about 1% for the last 9 hours. Nothing so far. No matches. Nothing, he said. Right. Dozens of victims, dozens of locations, several months of security footage, she replied. I can't imagine we'd have been able to go through any of this just 20 years ago. It would be like putting together shredded documents. But they solved a lot of cases back then with some serious patience I know I wouldn't have. I'm ticked that we're only at 1% of the footage with this stuff we've got now. But back then, this was lightning speed, he said. The computer continued to process millions of frames as the FBI sought to identify a person or persons who may have appeared at the same locations as many of the victims who lay in the hospital. Unless this was an unknown virus, this appeared to be their only other option. It was a hope that could potentially lead authorities to potential terrorists or perhaps simply a crazy chemist, or as simple as those who once placed poison in Tylenol tablets known as the Chicago Tylenol murders. No suspect had ever been charged or caught in those murders, where victims who had purchased the pain relief medication had been dosed with cyanide. This incident was the main cause of various medications having tamper-proof packaging, which to this day had become the industry norm. Today, the CDC, FBI, and state and local authorities were just trying to figure out the source. Whether it was a virus or foul play, there simply had to be some sort of medical reason for the numerous zombie-like patients who lay in the hospital. There are 2 systems at play right now, he said. One is compiling the footage. One has already begun generating facial recognition as the system uploads the footage. The system hit 2%. Whoa, 2%, said Cynthia. Dal smiled. Yeah, we're on a roll, he said. So how do we see who the computer is picking up? Where do we look? Cynthia replied. You minimize the screen, and then you see the system showing the regulars in the area behind this, he said as he pointed out a screen behind the main one they'd been reviewing. Some of these people are regularly going to show up just as a matter of routine. Mailmen, delivery trucks, same people. We're looking for people who aren't normally supposed to be there as often standouts, he replied. The computer will grab those faces and run them through the system automatically. Cynthia just looked at him. Wow, that is so over my head that I'm just glad I don't actually need to understand how any of that works in my division, she said. It's a niche thing. It's sort of like someone who wants to be a dentist. We handle the tedious stuff for the Bureau. We like puzzles, he replied. Cynthia just smiled as she looked at the screen on the computer. Puzzles, she said. Interesting. Well, that's what police work is. Yeah, but this is like those 10,000-piece puzzles, he said. Well, your puzzles can be put together by a computer. You're not in the field. These computers don't put your life at risk, she said. Dal didn't like that comment. Cynthia knew she let that out without more thought. But I know this is important. You're still saving lives, she said. Dal took it. Thanks, he said. Cynthia looked at the faces as they began to pop up. Nearly a dozen mailmen had been seen in the various locations where victims had been picked up and brought to the hospital. The photos were lining up one by one as the computer generated matches in the same locations on various dates. All the same faces and, said Dal. Cynthia looked at the screen as well. An old lady? Lots of them around, she replied. Yeah, well, she seems to be around a lot, said Dal. Chapter 15. Valerie sat in her basement and slowly began to stitch together one of her dolls, attaching the lint that fell from the Ku Klux Klan member that she had witnessed pummel 3 men in Athens, Georgia. Nutmeg and cinnamon sticks were also applied to the doll that she had created, along with other spices. I am doing right, she said to herself. There is no way I am not doing right. The basement seemed damp, a coldness that had never been there before. She could see her breath. "Oh, it's cold today. It's calling for you. This is about you,"
she said out loud, but to the recipient of her powers. He would not hear her, but soon he would feel the pain he had inflicted on the men whose lives he had destroyed. His trip to the store that day may have been simple. He just wanted to buy a pack of cigarettes, but instead had found Valerie, and his unwillingness to break a dollar bill and instead reach for the change in his pocket had resulted in giving Valerie the ammunition that would allow her to wreak havoc on his life. Deserved havoc awaited the man who was slowly killing himself anyways with each puff of the Marlboro cigarette he had ventured out to get that day. A mosquito landed on her arm. She swatted at it. "Well, you are rare. What you doing down here?" she said as she ended its life. "I didn't get you, but I see that life did. You're just a bug now," she said as she rambled, seemingly believing the bug was once a person recreated to live the short existence of an insect. She believed it. "Karma shows its face," she said. Valerie was changing. In the beginning of her knowledge of the powers she had never utilized those powers to even contemplate seeking out a grocery store manager. No, she saved those powers for the likes of whom she had discovered at the grocery store that day. A Ku Klux Klan member fit the mold. However, in her old age, Valerie's tolerance disappeared as she continuously pulled out her fabrics to create a doll for just about anyone who would piss her off. She never used her powers in this way before, but now was hell-bent on getting even with anyone who crossed her the wrong way. "I'm gonna get you good," she said. "You are gonna know what we've had to struggle with." A pain entered her head as she stopped what she was doing for just a moment. She could hear the screams of anguish that she had caused those who were encased in her shoebox. The voices screamed in agony, and she delighted in the knowledge that she had caused it. The hospital was now filled with numerous patients from Savannah who had angered her in some way. Some for merely cutting her off in her old age, some who disrespected her, and sometimes some who disrespected others. She was a bored old lady with an axe to grind. Life had made her old. She knew the clock was ticking in her own life, and she had many scores to settle before that day would come. The anger from the many experiences she'd endured as a young African-American woman had caught up to her. And now that anger had become something other than she'd ever remembered being. She didn't even realize that she was becoming these things or why. As the pain left her mind, caused by the torture of so many by the gifts she had misused, she continued to stitch the doll together, murmuring statements to herself that even someone standing next to her might not be able to understand. As the man in the grocery store sat in his chair at his home, crippling pain began to engulf and twist his body. As his wife screamed at what she was witnessing, he screamed in agony as his bones shifted throughout his body, turning him into a twisting heap of a human that slid off his reclining chair and onto the floor. Valerie could see all of this, and she laughed maniacally as she could sense the pain she was causing upon the man who had been part of an atrocity that she remembered all too well. She had often sat in her chair watching her soap operas while occasionally recalling that day. The day she saw this same man in the grocery store was to relive the day that became embedded in her mind. Bones could be heard cracking as the man's wife screamed, grabbing a phone to call an ambulance as she witnessed a horrific transformation of her husband, becoming almost inhuman before her eyes. The blood poured from his nose and into his own mouth as he choked on his own blood.
My God, what is happening? What is happening?"
His wife screamed as his body curled into something that was grotesque, and yet not too far as to render a mortal outcome. Wounds appeared on his flesh before her eyes.
"My God!"
she screamed. Valerie sat in her basement, seeing all this in her mind.
"Lady, you know nothing about him, do you?"
You don't know what he's done, she said as she realized that she had never told her who he once was. Whoever he'd become now was of no consequence. She would have her revenge. Valerie picked up the shoebox that contained the many dolls and added its new guest. The voices screamed as she put the lid back on the box, and she smiled again as she gestured goodbye to the box and began her long journey back up the stairs. "You know all the pain you've caused me," she said. Valerie had changed. Something else was taking over. Chapter 16. The ballroom of the Holiday Inn in Savannah had become a centralized location for the agencies and hospital associates to gather as they discussed the patients that appeared stuck in a zombie-like state. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Center for Disease Control, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and even a representative from the Joint Commission, an agency that observed various hospitals nationally, were present as a screen was propped up at the end of a large boardroom table. Present was Chief Marlon Frey, CDC Rep Claire DiStefano, Mayor Eddie DeLoach, and Georgia Governor Nathan Deal, and his assistant Paul Vinton, a 33-year-old political science major originally from Boston, and FBI agents Cynthia Bork and Dal Richards. Several uniformed police officers stood by alongside Detective Scott Wenger and Carlton Lynn. Dr. Elliot Claiborne stood alone, reading a book. He appeared halfway through Affirming Psychosis, the Mass Appeal of Adolf Hitler. "Real page-turner, Doc," said Detective Wenger. The doctor said nothing after acknowledging the remark with a nod. Governor Deal sat at the head of the table as the other participants in the room sat in the seats that surrounded the desk. The governor was reviewing the documents before him that had been supplied by every agency with initials, and slowly put it down in front of him. "What the fuck is going on?" the governor said, shocking everyone in the room. He was not known for that language, and no one had ever heard him even utter a profanity before. "I mean, I'm looking at the theories here. Every page is a theory. There's absolutely nothing in any of this paperwork that tells me you're any closer to finding out why these people are getting sick. Why is it all in Savannah, and whether it's a disease or an attack from someone? All of you are supposed to have expertise in all of this." "Sir, respectfully," said Claire as she was interrupted. "Claire, the president has called me twice this morning. Do you know how many times the president has called me in my life?" Claire just shook her head. "Never. Not even a note to acknowledge I won the election. Never, ever. This morning, twice. And he's talking about sending the National Guard next, and we have nothing. All of you have a job to do, and I'm not seeing any results. Someone tell me something I don't know already," the governor said as he slammed his fists on the table. The governor was not happy. "Well," a voice said, FBI agent Dal Richards, "we are only about halfway done putting people through a facial recognition program, but I might have something." Dal walked over to a screen at the end of the table and flipped on a slide machine. "It's 2016 and we're still using those?" said the governor. "We still use them, sir," Dal replied. "May I?" he said as he pointed to the slide machine. "Please show me something," said the governor. "Well, as I've said, we have compiled through a facial recognition program that individuals who seem to have been at every scene where victims have been picked up by paramedics or collapsed where family or friends had found them brought them to the hospital," said Dal. "How many matches?" said Claire, speaking for the first time. Dal turned on the projector and 4 faces appeared. "This is a FedEx employee," said Dal as he pointed to the top left photo. "This is a Sheridan employee," as he pointed to the top right picture. "Here on the bottom left is a man named Taylor Foster. He works at a Petco. And then there's this woman, a Valerie Lavoie, a 77-year-old woman." The governor put his head to the desk, his hands covering his face. Not another voice could be heard. "You're telling me you found a FedEx guy who probably delivers there every day, a hotel worker, a guy probably walking dogs, and my grandmother," said the governor. Dal felt like he wasn't providing any of the new information the governor had asked for. Well, Mr. Governor, the FedEx guy shouldn't have been working for them. Light on his background check. He had a felony for kiting checks. The employee worker has been arrested before, though not charged. The Petco employee was not scheduled to work on the days we've seen him in the area. And, well, the old lady seems to be everywhere, said Dal. The governor stood up livid.
Old ladies are always everywhere. That's what old ladies do. They walk around and look at things, the governor yelled. I am going to the President of the United States and tell him this. I want you to get on these four and bring back something. If any of these people are even involved, put some plainclothes cops on them.
The governor then looked to Claire.
What about you? Anything?
Claire looked irritated at the tone of the governor, but understood that it could be rattling to have the White House calling. It always rattled her as well. We are still testing the patients. We've got people coming in from Harvard, and a few specialists from Switzerland are on their way, she replied. The governor then looked at the doctor, Elliot Claiborne, along with the book the doctor was holding. Dr. Claiborne didn't require a question.
Let me guess. Mass hysteria, he said.
Chapter 17. FBI agent Dal Richards accompanied local Savannah detective Oliver Cosell to Savannah Forsyth Park as they began the task of watching one of the four individuals who had come up in the results of facial recognition software. Other detectives were hot on the trail of a FedEx employee, the hotel employee, and the worker who seemed to spend his off hours hanging around Petco a little too often. Valerie Lavoie and her grandson had company about 100 yards behind them as they took a stroll. "Your mother doesn't like it when you're around me, does she?" said Valerie. Brady smiled. "You're a little weird, Nana," he said. Valerie stopped in her tracks and looked at her grandson with a big smile. "I beg your pardon, young man. Your mother thinks I'm weird?" she said. "Well, yeah, you're always going on about spirits and potions and all that stuff. Then you disappear into your basement doing who knows what," he said. "What do you do down there all night?" Her face became more serious. "Nothing. I don't do nothing down there that is anyone's business but my own damn business. Don't you go rummaging through my things when I'm not there either," she said. The officers behind her were unnoticed. "Who's the kid?" said Detective Cassell. "That's Brady Lavoie, her grandson. She doesn't talk to her daughter from what we've been able to tell, but the kid talks to her." "Do we know why she doesn't talk to her daughter?" replied Detective Cosell. "I'm going to look into that," said the detective. Valerie and Brady continued to walk around the fountain in the north end of Forsyth Park. "I remember when they did a movie right here," she said to Brady. "Right here, you can see all this in a movie." "What movie?" he asked. "Oh, they done a few good ones here in Savannah. One had that Kevin Spacey in it. Don't remember the name, but it was a good one. Right here in this park. They did one called Cape Fear. Oh, I was so pretty then." Brady had a topic on his mind as they walked through the park, and he was trying to spit it out. "Nana," he said, "why don't you talk to my mom more? Why don't you two talk?" Valerie looked down toward the ground and shook her head. "She thinks I'm digging up snakes that shouldn't be dug up. She thinks I'm crazy. Just a crazy old lady," she said. "She's been thinking you're crazy a long time ago, back when you weren't so old, though," he replied. "Boy, I don't know which insult I should slap you for first," she laughed. "You just said 2 insults in 1 sentence, and that's a gift." Brady wasn't trying to be funny. "It would just be nice to know why you don't get along," he said. Valerie and Brady both sat down on a bench and looked around at the park. Valerie saw the 2 men in suits that had been following the both, but didn't appear to think much of it. "Taking a stroll, are you, boys?" she said towards them, both unable to hear her, and Brady not understanding. "What?" he said. Valerie got comfortable on the bench and then looked at Brady. "Your mother I will always love. You tell her that for me," she said. "Nothing I have ever done was any of her doing. She was the only thing, and you, who brought me joy these last years. I don't know quite why we haven't been very strong in each other's lives over the past few years, but I never did anything to her. I always make sure she has everything the other girls had. She had a lot more than I ever did when I was a girl. I had one dress that I wore to school every day, and I would put different flowers in a little pocket to make the dress look different. And you know what? Not a day happened where they didn't think I was wearing something different because of those flowers. I had them all fooled. Brady smiled. You've always loved your Nana, haven't you, Brady? She said. Of course, he replied. Well, time will come when you'll need to be okay, and I want you to know you will be. I done something, and it will show itself. You'll know what I'd mean someday. Keep everyone out of my kitchen, and you go through it yourself, she said. Brady seemed confused. I don't get it. What do you mean? He said. Are you daft, boy? I said never let no one in my kitchen, and you go through it. All of it, she said. Brady looked puzzled, but shrugged at the words. Okay, he said. Valerie looked at the two men leaning up against a tree about 50 yards from where she sat. Those men over there, you see 'em? She said to Brady. Yeah, I want you to reach for the moon. But in case you miss, you'll still hit a star. Brady laughed. Those men, she said again, now pointing to them. Watch those men. Brady looked at the FBI agent and Savannah detective. They knew their cover had been blown as they suddenly ran towards him. Nana, who are they? Nana? He said as Valerie had slumped over the bench. Nana! The officers saw the collapse from where they stood and were running to Valerie as she became unconscious. Today, Valerie would reach beyond the moon. Chapter 18. FBI agent Dal Richards sat with Claire DiStefano and Detective Cosell in the office of Dr. Peter Rubenfield at Memorial Health Hospital in Savannah, Georgia. He's been in the room for a while, said Dal. They called her DOA, but he's been up there for a while. His mother's in there trying to get him to leave. Well, I'm new to what's been transpiring around here, but from what I've been told, there's nothing comparable to the other patients that have been brought in, said Dr. Rubenfield. A young female nurse approached Claire, handing her a folder. Is this real? Said Claire. Yes, ma'am, it's real, she replied. What is it? Said Detective Cosell. Claire seemed to ignore the question, instead keeping her attention on the nurse. They all seem to wake up at the same time, at least the ones who have. There are still 3 others in exactly the same condition as when they came in, but everyone woke up at the moment we called a time of death on Miss Laveau, said the nurse. Everyone else in the room seemed to be at a loss. Okay, so wait a minute. Can one of you clue the rest of us in? Said Dal. This can't be. This doesn't make any sense, said Claire. Peter Rubenfield walked over to a very perplexed Claire DiStefano. May I? He said as he extended his hand out to grab the folder that the nurse had just delivered. The doctor looked at the file of papers, one page after another. I've never seen anything like this, and I don't know that there's even a medical explanation for any of what I'm reading right now. What this says is that at the time of death for Miss Laveau, 14 of the patients woke up, free of their symptoms. Except 3, said Detective Cosell. The woman died, and 14 of our comatose patients have woken up. I don't know what I'm looking at right now, said the doctor. Who are the 3 that haven't woken up? Doc, get some samples from Miss Laveau. I want a full report on everything. Let's get some charts from those who have woken up, and I want to know what their connection is to this woman. 1 person waking up is a coincidence. 14? This is something else. Get that psychologist down here as well, said Claire. The doctor just stared at the paperwork as though he'd just seen the color blue for the first time. Doc, said Claire, trying to get his attention. Yes, of course, I'm on it, he said as he exited the room. The nurse followed as Dr. Rubenfield's hand gestured direction. And the psychologist, she yelled as he walked out. Claire DiStefano, Detective Cosell, and Agent Dal just looked at the table in front of them, unsure how they might engage this topic, and attempt to do so in a way where they did not feel stupid. "Who wants to go?" said Claire. "Well, it's sort of my job, not the doctor's, to see if or how she was connected to her," said Detective Cosell. "I'll take the information from anywhere I can get it," said Claire. "Dal, your thoughts?" "I want to see this for myself. Let's go see this for ourselves," replied Dal. "If this is all true, this is some X-Files shit, and we don't even really have an agency for that." "Well, since getting David Duchovny on the phone doesn't seem like a realistic option, I want to pull the resources off the other three, and let's focus on good old Valerie. I want to know what her connection was with those patients. And I want us watching this kid, her grandson," said Detective Cosell. The three of them stood up and walked to the hospital corridor, walking by the various rooms as patients they had seen comatose were now awake. "This isn't possible," said Dal. "The three who are still in a coma, who are they? What rooms are they in?" said Claire to a nurse standing in front of one of the rooms. "Those three are the most severe cases of them all. They have physical symptoms beyond the comas the other patients were in. One of those comas was induced," the nurse said. "Well, then uninduce that patient," replied Claire. "See if that one wakes up." Detective Cosell walked up to Dal Richards. "What are you thinking about this? What are we looking at here?" "I have nothing," said Cosell. "Like I know?" replied Dal. "We might get some answers in the three who can't talk at the moment, but I just sent a text to my office, and these patients aren't leaving until they're interviewed. We've got some people coming now." Claire just stood there massaging her own jaw. "I don't get it." Chapter 19. Brady walked into his grandmother's home with his mother, Tina. Neither said anything as they walked into the living room of the home and sat there on the couch. The white sofa was a piece of furniture that Valerie had owned since before her daughter was born. Brady lifted a photo album from the coffee table in front of the couch and began looking through it. "Don't do that if it's going to upset you, Brady," said Tina. Brady was upset, his eyes welling up as he looked at the pages of his grandmother. "I wish that we had been more a part of her life," he said. "We should have been more a part of her life. She was bored." Tina didn't want to see Brady see her cry, and Tina had her own guilt about not spending more time with her mother. As a little girl, she had seen things that her mother had engaged in. It didn't mean much when she was a little girl, but as she went through high school and began to grow up, she had figured her mother was a little crazy, too crazy to bring her school friends home. When she had Brady, she didn't want to expose him to the insanity. "I don't know," said Tina as she walked out of the living room and into the kitchen. Brady continued to look through the book when he heard the basement door squeak. Brady wasn't going to get up with his mother in the house. He already could hear Tina yelling at him if he tried to snoop around the house. At the same time, Tina didn't want to be there at all. "Mom," he said. Tina walked back into the living room. "What are we going to do with all this? There's so much stuff in here. It smells like her," he said. Tina began to sob, and Brady walked up to his mother and hugged her. "I'm sorry I said that, Mom. No, don't worry yourself about it. I just can't be here right now," she replied. "Let's get out of here." Tina walked toward the door, but Brady sat back down on the couch to her surprise. "I want to stay for a while," he said. Tina was realizing that he may be processing this loss different than her. Her instincts had at first wanted to tell him no, that he should come home with her and they should come back later. She wouldn't argue about it, though, and decided that maybe he needed this somehow. "Okay, Brady. Just take the time you need, I guess. Look around if you want, just don't break anything. This stuff meant something to her, and I gotta respect that," said Tina. "I'm gonna go back to the hospital to deal with things that I need to. Then I have a lot of calls to make, so I'll see you at home, Brady. Love you. Love you too, Mom," he said, looking down at the photo album again. Tina left. The door was left open as the screen door shut behind her. Brady continued looking through the photo album. "I'm sorry, Gram. I don't know what happened." The basement door again squeaked, grabbing Brady's attention. Brady stood up and looked around his grandmother's house. The knickknacks on the shelves, the antique coffee cups in a glass-encased display. Pictures of him that hung on the walls gave him comfort. His grandmother truly loved him. Brady walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Several containers of pudding were in bowls prepared by Valerie. "You were going to eat these," he said to himself. The thought of his grandmother stirring up these bowls of pudding upset him somehow. He closed the refrigerator door. "This sucks, Nana," he said to himself. "I am sorry." Brady looked at the door to the basement and walked toward it. Looking down the stairs, the dust and mildew smell was typical of any basement one has seen. A string hung down from a light above the stairs, and Brady pulled upon it. The light illuminated the staircase as he walked down it. At the bottom of the stairs he noticed the small table where a small shoebox sat, and he walked over to them. A desk light was next to the shoebox as Brady turned the small light on. He opened the top of the box to see the dolls that Valerie had been paying the most attention to during the last days of her life. "What are all these, Nana?" he said as he pulled them from the box. As he looked through the various dolls without much interest, his eye caught a red and blue piece of fabric connected to a doll that looked like a man he had flashed back upon in his mind. "Wow, you look like Mr. Harrington down the street," he said to the doll as he looked at it. Also pinned to the doll appeared to be the 5 in a $5 bill. "What is this, Nana?" he said to himself. The door above the basement suddenly slammed shut, startling Brady. He dropped the doll back into the box and stood up quickly. He walked back towards the bottom of the stairs. "Someone up there?" he yelled. He began walking up the stairs, putting his first foot on a stair as he noticed a curtain in the basement. It appeared to cover a door that was missing from the basement. Brady walked toward the curtain and pushed the curtain to the left. Another string hung from the ceiling of that door, which he pulled on. It illuminated the small room. "What is all this?" he said to himself. Shoeboxes upon shoeboxes were stacked upon each other with different names on each box. Smith, Salazar, Redding, in red ink was sprawled upon one. Thomas, Bankman, Charles, on another. Many names were sprawled about 40 boxes in the small room. All shoeboxes, all with names written upon them. Walking to the boxes, Brady grabbed one and opened it. More dolls. He grabbed another box. More dolls. All of the dolls were personalized. They were handmade. They all meant something. Brady backed up and looked up the stairs. The door was now open in a welcoming way that made him feel as though now might be a good time to leave the basement. Something felt off. Chapter 20. He woke up. He remembered nothing, said Dr. Elliot Claiborne to FBI agents Dal Richards and Cynthia Bork. Claire DiStefano walked up to the men in the hallway of Memorial Hospital. "Anything?" she said. "Nothing," replied Dr. Claiborne. "We got nothing." Claire just sat in a chair outside of the patient's room. A man named Mark Blitz, who woke up from an induced coma, but destroying the hopes that he might be able to shed any light on what the cause was of the numerous patients who had succumbed to various illnesses that had hospital officials continuing to shake their head. "What was this man's condition? Anything?" Claire said, exhausted. "Someone lie to me." The 3 men just stood there and shook their head. Claire looked at the men, who were speechless, and just shook her head. "All right, well, we have 2 more patients in there. Tell me something about them. They are the only 2 who haven't woken up. So we have a bunch of people here who suddenly were cured when this Valerie passed away, and these 2 still in there. I want to know why," she said. "Why haven't they woken up?" Dr. Claiborne nodded toward the 2 FBI agents in a manner where he conveyed to them that they should leave him for a moment to have a private conversation with Claire.
and they both walked away. He pulled up a chair.
"I feel like I'm losing my mind," she said to Dr. Claiborne.
Dr. Claiborne sat next to her and looked around. "Claire," he said. There was a pause between the two.
"I answer to the President of the United States. I have to report back to him that we have no answers and that a man in a top hat appeared at the end of a hallway and disappeared," she said.
"Well, we all saw it too, so you won't look crazy," he replied.
"No, Elliot, not true. They are going to think we're all crazy here. I will never turn in a report to the President that we all hallucinated," she replied.
The remark seemed to get his attention. "Hysterical delusion, mass hysteria, conformity pressures," he said almost to himself more than to Claire.
Claire shook her head in agreement. "That could be something I could put in a preliminary report, worded that way. I feel better about that," she said.
"It's the cause. I mean, I've been sucked into this myself, and I'm a bit embarrassed by it," said Dr. Claiborne. "This is something I have never encountered either, Claire. We're all just discovering something new here. I don't understand the cause either, and I thought I'd—"
"Read enough books?" Claire interrupted.
Dr. Claiborne laughed. "That's funny," he said, waving to the FBI agents as they came back. Both FBI special agents approached them. "Where are we at?" said Agent Richards.
"Well, we're going to find everything out about the two people who haven't walked out of here, and I want someone on Valerie Laveau's grandson. See what he's doing," said Claire.
Dr. Claiborne stood up. "And I am going to call some people that I know overseas. See what I can find out about this mass hysteria thing," said Dr. Claiborne. Claire looked down towards the floor as Special Agent Dal Richards took the seat that Dr. Claiborne had previously sat in. "I know that you're with the CDC and all," said Agent Richards.
"Uh-oh, starting to really feel like a woman right now," she replied.
"I don't know what that means. I mean, I know what you mean, but I don't live in that world, so that's not what I mean. What I mean, Ms. DiStefano, what if this is all something we can't explain?" replied Agent Richards. Claire stared at him for a moment and then laughed.
"Oh, come on," she said. "Seriously? You're with the FBI and you actually are telling me you think that something supernatural is going on?"
Agent Richards laughed along at the ridiculousness of what he had just said. Then his face became serious. "Claire, I don't really know if what I'm saying is funny," he said as he turned around and walked towards Dr. Claiborne. Claire just sat there realizing that she had just had a very strange interaction.
"This is what chaos feels like,"
she said as she looked up at Special Agent Cynthia Bork.
"We have these titles for a reason, Claire. We'll figure this out," Cynthia replied. "I don't think that what's happening here cares about our business cards," replied Claire. "Whatever it is."
Chapter 21. Savannah Detective Oliver Cosell sat in his car across the street from a Starbucks as he watched Brady Lavoie sit alone at a table outside. Brady was drinking something red and looking at his cell phone. FBI Special Agent Cynthia Bork sat next to him in the car. "Nice to feel useful again," he said as he watched Brady.
"We aim to please at the Bureau,"
she replied while looking at her own cell phone, replying to yet-to-be-replied emails. She didn't catch Detective Cosell's dirty look in her response.
"I have no idea what we hope to gain by watching this kid," said Cosell. "Seems glued to that damn cell phone." "All kids are his age," Cynthia replied. "They are the zombies amongst us, right there. Every kid his age, staring into those things, playing games. Very different generation."
"It's a spoiled generation," he replied. Brady got up and walked towards a trash can, throwing the cup in the trash.
"He's on the move,"
said Detective Cosell. Brady threw his half-full cup in the garbage and began walking down the sidewalk and towards his grandmother's house.
"Don't let him make us. Just go slow," said Cynthia.
"I've done this before, Special Agent," he replied with a tad of annoyance in his voice. About 4 blocks down the road, slowly following Brady, who remained unknowing of the tale on him, he walked past his grandmother's house.
"Where's he going?"
said Detective Cosell. 3 more blocks down, and Brady stopped at a home. It was the home of Tom Harrington. Harrington worked at the local Savannah credit union. Brady had never met him, but remembered the story his grandmother had once told him about the man.
He tries to cheat people of a certain age out of their homes. They call it a reverse mortgage. Some bullshit like that.
He remembered his grandmother telling him. But still, he could have sworn that he saw a doll that looked like Mr. Harrington in the shoebox at his grandmother's home in the basement.
"Call in that address. See who lives there,"
said Special Agent Bork. Brady walked up the stairs of the house.
"He doesn't look like he even knows where he's going or who lives there," said the detective.
"Call in the address," the agent repeated.
Brady rang the doorbell and stood at the door. No one answered.
"I'm going to get out," said Detective Cosell.
"No," replied Special Agent Bork. "Just sit. Watch."
Brady began to walk back down the stairs and was ready to walk away from the house. Suddenly, the officers in the car saw Brady stop and turn around back toward the home. The woman, approximately 60 and a tad overweight, had opened the door.
"Yes?"
she said to Brady. Brady seemed a little confused as to why he was even there. A curiousness had been piqued within him. He almost was going to apologize and tell a white lie that he got the wrong house, but he blurted it out.
"I'm just wondering if Mr. Harrington lives here?"
said Brady. She looked a little puzzled, but answered,
"Why, yes, that's my husband, but he can't come to the door right now. He's sick," she said.
"I ain't sick," a voice could be heard behind her. The man pulled in front of his wife in an electric wheelchair, crippled by a disease that one might only be able to guess as he spoke sideways, his head too heavy to be held up by his neck any longer. "What do you want? Who are you?" he said. Brady didn't have a good story to tell. He'd made up nothing and certainly didn't expect to see a man so crippled by a disease that he could barely talk. "Well, what do you want?" he said again.
"Let me bring you back inside," said the woman.
"Shut up," he said to the woman. "I got a visitor, and I want to know what he wants. What do you want, kid?" he said. Brady was shaken by this encounter. He said the first thing he could think of.
"My grandmother, I think she knew you. I thought you might want to know she passed away because she might have been a friend," Brady said.
Mr. Harrington looked puzzled.
"Oh," said Mr. Harrington. "Okay, well, thanks for stopping by."
Clearly, Mr. Harrington had no idea who Valerie was. He didn't recall if she was a bank customer, but had enough spirit left in him, despite the anger of his condition, to not come off rude to Brady.
"Well, I'm sorry to hear that,"
Mr. Harrington said as he put his wheelchair in reverse. The woman who had opened the door swiftly closed it without saying anything, herself confused by the intrusion. Brady just gestured a goodbye and walked away. Both officers continued to look from their car.
"What the fuck was that?"
said Detective Cosell. Special Agent Bork shook her head, realizing she realized nothing. Chapter 22. Chief Marlon Frey stood among his men at the front desk at the Savannah Police Department, coffee in hand.
"It's out of my hands, thank God,"
he said to an officer. The officer was Peter Williams, who had worked the front desk for 2 years. He was happy to do so, with no goal to work the streets or to work his way towards becoming anything more than he was. He didn't want to be a detective or a lieutenant, but just the man in uniform who handled intake and bail bondsmen. His wife was more than thankful for the lack of goals. It meant he'd stay alive in a dangerous world where police sometimes don't come home after work.
"I hear you. I don't even know what some of the initials stand for that have walked by me this week. They are coming through everything. I've been referring reporters to public information. I've been referring people to places I never even heard of. And just from a chart I got from that CDC woman, Claire something," said Peter.
"Claire DiStefano," said the chief. "She's been up my ass since she got out here."
"Get a load of what just walked in,"
said Peter, pointing to the front entrance of the police station. An African-American man in a brown gown approached the front desk. A necklace consisting of beads and what happened to be leaves were sprawled across his neck.
"Gentlemen, hello,"
said the man. The chief and Officer Williams looked at each other, trying not to laugh. Peter had almost laughed many times behind this desk and put his professional face on. The chief patted him on the shoulder and walked away, winking at the officer before he did so. "What can I do for you, Mr. " said Officer Williams. "My name is King Ki'ame, and I am from New Orleans, though originally from Haiti. I would like to speak to someone in charge," he said. Officer Williams just looked at him. He'd seen crazy people come in and out over the years, but this man had a certain intensity about him that had the officer pull out a pad and pen. "All right, well, what is this about, and what's your name again?" he said. "King Ki'ame." Officer Williams wrote the name down. "Okay, so the first name is King, last name is Ki'ame," said the officer. "No, King is not my first name. I am King Ki'ame." Officer Williams put his head down. "I was afraid you were going to say that," said the officer. The men just looked at one another. "Okay, I'll buy it," said the officer. "King of what?" The king looked around the station as the officers caught notice of that strangely dressed man speaking with Officer Williams. "I hail from Haiti, and I know that none of you know what is happening here in Savannah. I do. I know the cause, and I need to speak to someone with a very open mind about what I have to say," said King Ki'ame. "In what I do, I am king, and I don't expect you to take me seriously or to believe me. But what I have to say to you is true. So, try to pretend that I am telling you the truth about who I am and what I know." Officer Williams shook his head in agreement that he would, for the time being, pretend the man before him was not a nut who had just strolled in through the front door. He didn't smell alcohol on the man, he didn't appear to be armed, and King seemed to have no concern about the words that were coming out of his mouth in a police station. "So what is the cause of what's been happening around here, King Ki'ame?" he said, attempting to pronounce the name. "Hoodoo. It is within the voodoo tradition, a tradition formed in Louisiana. It is a power I know that you won't believe, but that's why I need to discuss this with someone who will believe what I have to say," said King Ki'ame. "Well, you realize that this is a little, out there, right, King?" said the officer, sounding a tad condescending. King Ki'ame was already feeling the doubt. "My friend, I have come a long way to share news with you, to help you solve the issues you are having in this city. If you do not want my help, I can walk right back out that door and you can all deal with this yourselves. I won't beg to help you," said King Ki'ame. The officer's first instinct was to tell the man to leave the station, but something about the way the man talked made him feel as though he might just regret that decision. "You can see the future, can't you?" said King Ki'ame. The officer was puzzled. "What do you mean?" said Officer Williams. "You know that you will look back on this moment, that you should listen to me. You know that right now. You think I am a crazy man, but you know I have something someone will want to hear," said King Ki'ame in the lobby of the Savannah police station. The officer closed his notepad. "Okay, King, why don't you have a seat right over there?" said Officer Williams, pointing to a chair across the hall from where the king stood. King Ki'ame shook his head in agreement. "Thank you, officer. I will do that." The officers all watched as this strange man sat and waited. The only problem was, Officer Williams didn't know what initials to refer this one to. Chapter 23. Brady Lavoie sat in the basement of his grandmother's home feeling uneasy about the sudden access he had to the home. His grandmother always welcomed him, but he didn't feel right walking into her home without her there. But she wasn't coming back. There was a sense of comfort that Brady had, the comfort that comes with knowing that when someone dies, they haven't gone to a destination that he wouldn't one day go himself, wherever that may be. He knew, even as young as he was, that one day he would follow his grandmother to that place we will all one day go. His grandmother's beliefs, despite his mother's best efforts to keep him from them, did instill a sort of spiritual interest that he never discussed openly. High school students are into sex, drugs, alcohol, and Xboxes, not Deepak Chopra or Marianne Williamson lectures. This is what separated Brady from most kids. He could turn it on or off when he wanted to. But for the most part, he was into the same things the other pupils at his school were. When he was alone and in deep thought, that's when he felt like he wanted to know what was next. Reading books on the spiritual never bothered his mother. It was apples and oranges in her mind. If he was reading positive books and positive things like that, then all the better. The issue was an issue that Brady's mother Tina had either denied or didn't want to know, was that Valerie Lavoie was never playing with dolls either. She was getting even. Brady once again sat at the desk and slowly lifted the cover from the box, exposing the dolls once again. He looked around the room, readying for some sort of sound that would come from the room, but this time there was no spooky sound, a door creaking, or any sound that gave him the willies. Digging through the box, he discovered the doll that looked like Mr. Harrington. The pins and various pieces of cloth and money were attached to the doll. Brady's cell phone went off in his pocket, and he pulled it out. It was a text message from his mother. "Where are you?" it said from his mother. Brady texted her back. "I am just cleaning up at Nana's house," he replied. There was no response to the text, and Brady put it back in his jeans. Brady held the doll in his hands, looking at it in great detail. "What were you doing down here all this time?" he said in the room, as if speaking with his grandmother. "This looks like Mr. Harrington, Nana." Opening a drawer to the desk, Brady found a box of envelopes and pulled one from the box. Slowly, he began pulling the pins and pieces of items that Valerie had stuck in the doll to make it look like Mr. Harrington. He carefully placed the items into the envelope, and after sealing it, placed it into one of the small desk drawers that were empty. He wanted to know exactly where he had put it. He wanted to respect his grandmother and what she had done, despite not knowing exactly what that was. He was going on a sort of unexplainable instinct. "Brady!" a voice from above the stairs yelled. "What?" said a startled Brady, responding to the voice of his mother. "Get your ass up here now! I don't want you down there! I don't want you anywhere near all that stuff! It's full of crazy!" screamed Tina. Brady put the cover back on the shoebox, including the doll he had just been removing the pins and items from, and placed the box beneath the desk. "Get up here!" Tina yelled again. "I'm coming, jeez," Brady replied. Brady walked back up the stairs and shut the light off from the top of the stairs using the string that hung from the light. "She never lived in 2016, said Brady, looking at the string. "Never heard of the clap-on, clap-off." "She never lived anywhere in this century, Brady. Now tell me what you were doing down there. What did you touch?" Brady seemed surprised at his mother's response. What did she care about what he may have or haven't touched if she didn't believe in any of this? "Mom, I'm just looking through everything, trying to organize it all," he said. "Well, one thing she was organized. I don't want you touching any of that stuff down there. She spent a lot of time putting whatever it was together," replied Tina. "Mom, it's her stuff. We're going to have to go through it sometime," he said. Tina looked upset. She didn't want to argue with him. "Can we bury her first, Brady?" said Tina. Tina turned around and walked toward the front door of the house. "Why would you say something like that to me?" said Brady. "She's my grandmother, and I spent a lot of time with her even though you didn't want me to." Tina took issue with the statement and turned around toward Brady. "You think I didn't love my mother? I love my mother. I don't know what you saw down there, but I saw a lot of that shit my whole damn life, and I didn't want you getting wrapped up into the hocus-pocus shit. I don't know what she was involved in, but whatever it was, she obviously wasn't making a living out of it. It was all a waste of time, filled with nothing more than the crazy beliefs of a woman who never could separate fact from fiction, and I didn't want you to be a part of any of that bullshit. Does that make me a bad mother? You tell me. You've always had the best of everything," said Tina. Brady understood that a lot of this anger was coming from her own personal loss. Perhaps Brady had forgotten about that for a time. "Mom, come here," he said. Tina walked over and burst into tears as Brady held her. "I already miss knowing she's here. Knowing she was here was enough," said Tina. "Just knowing she was here." Brady continued to hug her as she cried on his shoulder. "It's gonna be okay, Mom. I'm sorry,"
he said. Tina wiped her face and regained composure. Listen, I'm your mother. I love you. You can go through all of this later. There's time. Right now, I need you to help me get through the services. They're going to be simple because that's what she wanted. That much I know. Then if you want to come here and play archaeologist, you can do what you want, said Tina. Brady understood. His mother simply needed him now. Okay, Mom. I'm sorry. I'll do whatever you need. Tina smiled and grabbed her son's hand as they walked out of the house. Brady looked back at the house before getting into his mother's car. I'll be back, Nana. I want to know everything, he said to himself. Chapter 24. Claire DiStefano sat in an interview room with the Savannah Police Department. FBI Special Agent Dal Richards was also sitting at the table next to the CDC head, along with Chief Merlin Frey, who stood behind the two of them leaning up against a wall. Detective Oliver Cosell stood up against the door. King Kiyame sat at the table, a man in total control and with no feeling of intimidation running through his veins. The man was not impressed. He was there to tell a story. The group before him could either believe him or they did not have to. He didn't care. Claire looked a little uneasy about this conversation, but she was running out of options. Okay, so King Kiyame, right? She said. Yes, that is me, said King Kiyame. Can I ask you, not to be rude, but what exactly are you king of? She said. The chief just put a hand on his face, wanting so much to say something rude, but holding himself back. Listen to me, all of you, because I'm not going to do this thing you're doing right now. I'm here to tell you what is happening. My birthplace and my history is not relevant to any of this, said King Kiyame. It's relevant if we say it's relevant. You walk in here and tell us you know how chaos in Savannah has started, and we need to know you are credible, injected Detective Cosell. Sir, from what I understand, all of your more credible explanations have been thrown to the wayside. You have no explanation, nor will you ever find one using the science you are all using as a guide, said King Kiyame. Otherwise, I highly doubt you would all be in this room waiting to hear what a man dressed like me has to say. Ordinarily, you'd have me in straps by now. Claire nodded toward the detective to let her handle the conversation with a sort of wincing look. The look said, "Shut up." The floor is yours, King Kiyame. Please do explain. What has been the cause of this? She said. FBI Special Agent Dal Richards shook his head in a small display of disgust. Okay, I am going to tell you what I know, and then I'm leaving. You'll take what I say and do with it what you will. When you need me, you'll know where to reach me. More importantly, you'll know when you need me, he said. Okay, go on, said Claire. Have you seen a man in a top hat? Said King Kiyame. This instantly turned the feeling that King Kiyame was a weirdo into something far more credible. Get the psychologist in here, said Chief Frey. Claire put her hand out for the chief to also shut up. Go on, said Claire. King Kiyame smiled. I'm not here to relish in being right. I'm here to help. The man you have seen is Baron Samedi. He is the Loa of Death, said King Kiyame. He was sent here by his wife, Mammon Bridget. She sent him to help let her in. Wait, let her in? Said Claire. The room was in awe of what they were hearing. Jackpot. What do you mean let her in? Where are they going to let her in? Said FBI Agent Richards. In. Next. The place we all venture to. But she was angry. She was about justice, but then became something else. She's not who she was supposed to be. Baron is here to collect a soul that is still here. The woman you were following, Valerie. Her. It's her. You will never find a connection of those patients to each other, but you will find a connection to her. Perhaps one of those patients killed someone, or I suspect someone may have cut her off at a red light or stepped on her foot. Something changed, and she used her power to do something other than she was supposed to do. She had become something else. When she died, I will venture to bet that those in a coma woke, said King Kiyame to a captivated audience. Most of them, said Claire. Most of them woke up. Then those are people you need not worry about. But if any have not awoken, Claire cut him off. Two have not woken up, said Claire. Then I imagine you won't want to, because if you dig deep within their lives, they must have done something quite evil to have sustained the same condition beyond Valerie's death. And she has died, said King Kiyame. How did you know she died? Said Chief Frey. The king stood up from the chair. All in the room just stared at him in disbelief of all the man had known. The questions they had were just beginning, but they all knew that this was all they were going to get out of him. There was an excitement. She told me she did, King Kiyame replied. There was a silence in the room. King Kiyame was about to walk from the room. You all know where I am. My number was taken by the kind officer in the lobby. If you feel you need me, let me know. If I feel needed and you're not sure that I am, I'll know already, said King Kiyame. This is some fucked up shit, said Chief Frey. Chief Frey, please, said Claire. I'm just saying this is, right? Isn't it? Said Chief Frey. Ignoring the question, Claire stood up. So there's no drugs involved or disease, said Claire to King Kiyame. Oh, there's most certainly something to all this, but nothing you're going to find in your books. That was no mass hallucination. That was someone who showed himself to you. It's important that Valerie reach the other side because she will be very important in the next world. She cannot, however, move on until she has let go of the things she has attached herself to in this one. She has done this to herself, said King Kiyame. King Kiyame shook his head to the people in the room and walked out of it. Everyone just sat there, quietly. Claire looked around the room at the faces that had no idea what to say. Where are we on the grandson? Said Claire. Chapter 25. Detective Cosell and Agent Dal Richards sat in the squad car outside the home of Mr. Harrington's house. I don't feel like this is what we do, said Detective Cosell. What do you mean? Replied Dal. We generally look to get the bad guys. That's what we do. We get the bad guys. We arrest them. We put them in jail. That guy in the station, King whatever, I don't understand what we're doing, replied Detective Cosell. We're investigating. That guy knew a lot. But who knows how he knew it? We keep putting this puzzle together to try to make sense of it, replied Dell. This is the job. The detective looked at his coffee cup. We're being asked to help free a woman's soul. They didn't teach this at the academy, said the detective. No, we're being asked to figure out why all of these people ended up in a hospital and why 2 others are still in a coma. We're doing background checks on the 2 who are still in the hospital, who have yet to wake up. We're playing ball with the king for a bit. See what he's all about. Who knows? Said Agent Dell. Let's just go do this, said Detective Cosell. See why this kid was at the house. Detective Cosell and Agent Dell both got out of the car. A car almost clipped Detective Cosell, who was driving the car. Hey, he said as the vehicle just a careless driver drove by. Fucking guy almost clipped my ass, he said. The coffee had spilled a little from his cup. Maybe you should leave that in the car, said Agent Dow. If they invite you in to talk, they won't offer coffee if you've got one in your hand. The detective thought a second. Good idea, the detective replied, putting the coffee back into his vehicle. Both men walked across the street toward the house. This'll probably be a pretty quick day, said Agent Dow. I can use a quick day. Walking up the stairs to Mr. Harrington's house, they noticed many cars parked along the side of the street. They must be having a party, said Detective Cosell. Look at all these cars. I don't think I've ever seen this many cars on this side of the road. Well, the guy is sick. I never did a birthday check. Maybe it's his birthday, replied Agent Dow. We should have brought a cake, the detective laughed. Agent Dow rang the doorbell, which didn't seem to be working. Knock, said Detective Cosell. Special Agent Dal Richards proceeded to knock on the screen door. They can't even hear this knock. The screen isn't hitting the door when I'm knocking it. It's like knocking on a trampoline, said Agent Richards.
"Let me see," said Detective Cosell. Detective Cosell knocked on the wood panel next to the door. Hey, police, can we talk to you?" he said. Nothing. "This is how you knock on doors around here?" said Agent Richards to the detective. "This is how we get things done. If we had it your way, you'd wait for a warrant to knock. Not how we get things done here in Savannah. We're a different kind of community," said the detective. "Whatever that means," responded the agent. The jingling sound of a door chain could be heard as presumably the woman they had seen answer the door was attempting to unlock the door. The door opened. Mr. Harrington stood at the door. The look in his eyes was one of fear and confusion. A man petrified, but who answered the sound of the pounding. Detective Cosell and Agent Richards both took a step back, with Cosell almost falling back off the stairs, but gaining control enough to avoid falling down them. Are you Mr. Harrington?" said Agent Richards, dumbfounded. Just as startled as the officer, he replied, "Yes, I am." "Excuse me, but how are you Mr. Harrington?" said Agent Richards. Mr. Harrington just stood there speechless. "Sir, yesterday you were in a wheelchair. You looked almost paraplegic. And today you look like the pillar of health. Was that you in the wheelchair yesterday?" said Detective Cosell. "Yes, that was me," he said. "How was that you? How did you go from that condition to answering the door?" said Agent Richards. "Sir, I woke up this morning expecting my wife to do what she always does. This morning I woke up and sat up and then I stood up, and I don't know the answer to any of your questions, but to be honest with you, I don't want to know why. I don't need to know why. If you're here to figure that out, then you're knocking on the wrong door. Thank you for coming by," Mr. Harrington said as he slammed the door. "That guy was scared," said Agent Richards. "Fuck that guy, I'm scared," replied Detective Cosell. "This can't be real. What we just saw can't be real." Both men walked down the stairs, the detective clearly shaken as Agent Richards appeared to be maintaining his composure rather well. "Explains to me why all the cars are here. They're all in there celebrating," said Agent Richards. "They are all in there scratching their heads just like us. We need to call Claire on this. Get her out here," said Detective Cosell. "He's not going to talk to anybody. That guy is scared to death," said Agent Richards. The two men walked to their car and got in. "Remember what I said about a pretty quick day?" Brady Lavoie stood stunned as he witnessed Mr. Harrington standing. He knew it. Chapter 26. Sitting in the lobby of Memorial Hospital in Savannah, neurosurgeon Dr. Mark Castillo sat with Claire DiStefano and Special Agent Dal Richards. Dr. Castillo had been treating the numerous patients from the beginning of the saga that had unfolded on Savannah. He had received a call from Martin Colombe of the CSIS, which stood for Canadian Security Intelligence Service. It would be comparable with the FBI in the United States. Martin was a man in his 50s, wearing a suit and tie with a gray shadow of a beard. His assistant, Amanda Reimer, 36, sat by his side, wearing slacks and a white blouse. The attractive woman caught the eye of Special Agent Richards, but the glance he gave her didn't seem to get her attention, or he hadn't looked long enough. "Special Agent Richards, Ms. DeFano, I called you in after receiving a phone call from Mr. Colombe here," said Dr. Castillo. "Director Colombe, why don't you let me have a go at this, eh? Floor's yours," replied Dr. Castillo, gesturing his arm toward the participants of this quickly put-together meeting. "Thank you. So, I received a phone call from an agent in your D.C. bureau. Apparently you did a check on 2 patients here in the U.S., and Interpol alerted us to a hit on a gentleman in the custody of this hospital." The doctor reacted strangely to that comment. "Custody?" he replied. The director shook his head in agreement with the correction. Yes, well, I meant your care," said the director. "One of the gentlemen upstairs is wanted in Canada for multiple homicides, and given he's likely been here in Georgia for years, there are undoubtedly atrocities he's committed here that he's never been caught for. He has a fake identification, but I assure you his prints are a match, photos are a match, and the man in your care is a wanted fugitive in Canada, and likely linked to numerous other murderers," said the director. Claire shook her head in disbelief. "This just gets better," she said. Agent Richards decided to chime in to Dr. Castillo.
Dr. Castillo, alert local PD to cuff this patient, he said.
Yes, absolutely, replied the doctor as he pulled out his cell phone and walked away from the group. Director Colombet acknowledged the order by the special agent with a shake of his head.
Tell me, how did you come to find this man? Said the director.
Claire looked down and shook her head.
Ms. DiStefano, can you tell me, how did you come to find this man? What is his prognosis? Said the director.
Claire stood up from the chair and stood behind it, grabbing the back of the chair with her hands as she looked at the Canadian director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Agency.
We don't know, she said. We have some rather strange things going on around here that we're not sure we can exactly explain, she replied. Come again, said the director. Where was he when you found him? Why is he up there comatose? I don't know. None of us know. There were 11 or so patients brought in. Some collapsed in the street. This one was found in a Starbucks, collapsed inside the coffee shop. That was it, she replied. Of those brought in, 2 are still unconscious, and your perpetrator is one of them. Alleged, I assume.
Nothing alleged about this guy. He filmed videos doing his ghastly deeds, said the director. This brought about silence for a moment. No one wanted to visualize this man's crime. This patient went from being considered a victim to apparently being on Interpol's radar as a mass killer.
Regardless, we want him back in Canada. When he awakens, we want him on our soil, he said.
Special Agent Richards again entered the fray.
Well, he has no criminal record here, so there's nothing we need him for. We would like to have someone able to monitor his prognosis if we allow the transfer. Give us that, and I'll get the Attorney General and Immigration in on this, and you can bring him north, said Agent Richards. Sounds fast, said Claire. We don't want the public finding out their tax dollars are funding a wanted murderer's treatment. They can have them. Besides, we both know we probably aren't going to get a medical answer here, said Agent Richards. Now that's a strange thing to say. How can you be so sure? Said the Canadian director.
Claire just looked up at Agent Richards. Richard shook his head no to Claire, unseen by the Canadian authority. Claire got the message. She wasn't about to tell him that a guy named King Kiyame told them that some sort of entity or person known as Baron Simadai had appeared at a high school, then the hospital, and that the spirit of a woman named Valerie Lavoie had somehow cursed numerous individuals who ended up in a hospital in Savannah. Instead, she smiled at the director.
Well, we'll keep trying, she smiled.
Then she stood up and shook his hand.
I've got a lot of work to get back to, so I'm sure Special Agent Richards can help you from here, said Claire. I'm sure he can make the transfer go through smoothly, and please keep us updated on his condition. Well, he will awaken in a prison hospital, we hope. Then he can face his victims, said the Canadian director. I have a feeling he's going to face them no matter what, said Claire.
The Canadian Security Intelligence Director smirked oddly, having no idea what Claire was talking about. In fact, he'd had just about enough of it, and was just eager to return to Toronto with the fugitive.
Director, I do have a question. Why did you come yourself? Why not send agents?
Said Special Agent Richards. The Canadian director walked to the door and turned around to Claire.
One of his victims. It was my father. He was just mowing his lawn, and that bastard killed him. He'd lived his whole life, got to such a ripe old age, and then that man you have in custody just shot him. No reason. Didn't steal anything. He just shot him, said the director. I see. And I'm sorry, said Claire,
as the others in the room put their heads down uncomfortably.
Good day,
said the Canadian director as he left the hospital lobby. Chapter 27. Chatham County Superior Court Judge Harold Murray has seen many motions during his tenure as Chief Judge. He's presided over cases too many to count in his 30 years on the bench. Today he sat behind his desk as Special Agent Cynthia Bourke sat before him. The judge looked at her.
"They sent you down here for this one, I see," said the judge. "I don't blame them.
Every affidavit for what this warrant application is requesting is from people who aren't sitting but a block from this office, and yet they sent you down here," said Judge Murray. "Alone." Special Agent Bork sat there with an uneasy look upon her face. "Nothing to say," the judge continued. "Well," she grunted, "I think I'm sort of the messenger on this one." The judge shook his head in agreement and softly smiled. He leaned back in his chair. "I know this is Savannah, and a lot of weird motions have come upon this office, many applications, and I tend to side with law enforcement because I know them to be very meticulous when investigating. However, what this is asking for is beyond my wildest imagination, Special Agent. I mean, I'm looking at your probable cause, and it sounds like something out of a science fiction novel," said Judge Murray. "Perhaps science nonfiction is the way to look at the warrant application," she replied. The judge laughed loudly. "Ha ha! Now that is a new one if I've ever heard it. Science nonfiction," he laughed. "I love it. Cite me a case on that one, please." Agent Bork took a deep breath. She knew this was going to be a speech. "Your Honor, many times we discover new things. I realize that this warrant application is rather peculiar, but the things you're reading in those affidavits are accounts made by law enforcement, children, and a teacher from a high school, a psychologist," she said as she was interrupted. "Mass hysteria. It's happened before," said Judge Murray. "Your Honor, not like this. Perhaps there is a scientific explanation to all of this, but unless we can investigate this, we won't know. There's no evidence of mass hysteria, any sort of psychotic drugs or hallucinations in the background of any of those who have filed the affidavits attached to this motion. Some of those affidavits are people known to Your Honor, and I think you have to take the reputations of those attached to our petition into account," said Agent Bork. The judge again just looked at the warrant application. "So you're asking me for permission to allow you to raid the house of this deceased woman and her grandson. Your probable cause is a man in a top hat who appeared at a high school and a hospital corridor. You claim when she, this Valerie Levois, passed away, that the patients who had been brought in and seemingly were in some sort of coma woke up. I mean, geez, I've done worse in my life than some of the patients in this coma have been accused of. Mere parking tickets in their background," said Judge Murray. "Well, you were lucky enough not to do whatever. You may have done worse than unpaid parking tickets to Valerie Levois," she replied. The judge swung around in his chair. "Nope, can't say I ever met the woman. Appears from this horror tale that is a good thing," he replied. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. Swinging back around in his chair, he looked a little more determined. "Why have you not brought this to the feds? I mean, you're a federal agent. You've brought this into a state court. Surely you could have brought this affidavit to a federal judge," said Judge Murray. "My superiors believe that from a local level that you were the first tier we should approach," said Agent Bork. "The first tier. That's interesting," said Judge Murray. Both seemed to sit there not quite sure what to say next. "I need something to cite, a case. Give me something," said the judge. Agent Bork shook her head. "Please give me a moment to discuss this," she said as she pulled out her cell phone. "Oh, that's fine. I'm going to grab a cup of coffee. I'll be back in a few minutes. If you don't have something to cite, I'm denying this warrant application," said the judge. Several minutes went by as Special Agent Bork sat on the phone having about as rapid a conversation as she could, knowing that the time to brew a cup of coffee, if it wasn't already brewed, wouldn't give her much time to discuss. She should have known, she thought, that this application was about to be laughed at before she walked into the judge's chambers. No one else had seemed interested in the task at hand. Convincing a judge to sign a warrant based on the ramblings of a man who claimed to be a king, a ghost in a top hat, and so on.
It was Agent Bork, she felt, being thrown to the wolves on this application for a warrant.
Kitzmiller v. Dover Area School District,
she said as the judge walked back into the chambers. He sat down, placing his coffee on the desk.
Go ahead, explain.
Theory is not a fact, and that is obvious, and we both fully understand this. In that case, it was determined that Darwin's theory was just a theory, not a scientific fact, she said.
Go on, I'm being entertained,
said the judge.
The theory, given it is not fact, and as referenced in this cited case, is one that allows us all to continue to discover what has yet to be discovered, said Special Agent Bork. There are numerous court cases on the Santiago religion. The home she lived in, if as outlined in our affidavit, had resulted in supernatural occurrences that resulted in the coma victims, also has case law that would permit Your Honor to grant the motion,
she said with a straight face, though barely.
You're kidding me. Cite me something. I really want to hear this,
said the judge.
In the 1991 case, Stambowski v. Ackley, Helen Ackley sold her Nyack, New York property after she and other members of her family had apparently reported the house was haunted by poltergeists. In that case, the court declared the house was haunted as a matter of law, she said.
You're shitting me, said the honorable judge.
I mean, you're kidding me.
New Orleans, Section 54-312, fortune-telling and voodoo is against the law in attempting to manipulate the outcome of any circumstance that would otherwise naturally occur, said Special Agent Bork. Additionally, she said as she was interrupted,
please, stop, just stop, he said.
A pause came upon the two, both looking at each other as if they couldn't believe the ridiculousness of the conversation or the ridiculous ruling he was about to make.
This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to grant this warrant under seal. Anyone gets a leak of this, and I'll be sent to the funny farm, and all of you will be along for the ride with me. I'm not up for re-election, so I can only imagine someone in your world is actually serious about this. If this comes back to haunt me, I'll undoubtedly have the Commission on Judicial Conduct asking me for my resignation. But what the hell? Go see if this woman has secret potions putting patients in hospitals, said Judge Murray.
Agent Bork stood up.
Thank you, Your Honor, she said. Just go away. Seriously, out, he said as he pointed her towards the door.
The judge sat back down and exhaled.
I've been doing this long enough to hear that,
he said to himself. Chapter 28. King Kiyama sat on the same bench where Valerie Lavoie had died. The moon shined above him as the wind had the tree branches swaying left to right.
I'm here,
he said to the trees. The park was empty of a soul.
I am here. Come, talk to me,
he said again. The pain in the king's head was like an ice pick penetrating his ear.
I have never been able to understand that entrance,
said the king as he looked to his left to see Baron Samedi sitting next to him.
You're still in human form. I'm sorry it's not more pleasurable,
said Baron.
Tell me what it is you want, and tell me about the one who has yet to wake up.
Baron looked at the trees as well.
You know the trees can speak,
said Baron.
Yes, of course I do. Everything speaks that comes from the dirt. Even the dirt holds many secrets, said King Kiyama.
Baron's eyes were bright silver.
I can't look at you directly. I hope you understand. If I do, you won't be much use here,
said Baron. King Kiyama shook his head, signaling that he understood.
The one who has yet to wake up will never do so. Soon, he will move on,
said Baron.
I'm collecting him.
I'm not sure I understand. What did that man do that has prevented him from awakening when all others have? Replied King Kiyama.
Baron stood up.
With that one, it was a special thing. He was put down by Valerie, not for what he'd done, but for what he was going to do,
replied Baron. King seemed perplexed by this statement. "I don't understand. Our power does not provide us insight into the future," said King Kiyama.
What I've just told you is all you want to know. You do not want me going beyond this with you.
King looked up at Baron, whose back was now to him as he looked at the trees. "Do you see those trees the same way I do?" said King Kiyama.
No, I see them in a much different way, and your questions have reached their limit. Soon, Valerie will be released for her real place. What she was meant to be. She is meant to be something more, but she is fighting it."
King continued, stood up. "What can I do?" he said. "Why have you revealed yourself to so many?"
The many need to know there is more, but I know they will continue to talk themselves out of the truth. It is what some must do in order to move on. I've made this impossible because Valerie is much too important, and everything has led to where we are now. I will leave soon, but a seed has been planted.
"I am confused." Baron began to walk away.
You won't be. Things are just beginning to get interesting. And when Valerie arrives, things will be new.
This only led to more confusion by King Kiyama. He felt he had received no answers. Baron was from a different dimension. The first thing that the king had contemplated was the fact that the spiritual was entering the court system. But he knew he was thinking as a human. Baron, the king knew, could care less about the justice system. At least as we knew it. "Can you tell me what that man was going to do, the one who has to awaken?" said King Kiyama. The wind blew the branches into chaos as Baron began to fade away.
King Kiyama, that was no man.
Sitting back down on the bench, King looked at the ground. "I see," said King Kiyama to himself. Chapter 29. Brady Lavoie had no idea that Savannah police were currently serving a warrant on his mother's house as he began to unpin the dolls in each of the shoeboxes in his grandmother's basement. Blood poured down his fingers as he tried as fast as he could to free those whom had been condemned by his grandmother, Valerie Lavoie. "I'm sorry, Nana. I have to do this," he said to himself. So he thought.
"Brady! Brady!"
He heard a voice as he quickly turned around to see his grandmother standing in the basement with him. His dead grandmother. "Nana?" said Brady. "Nana!"
"You will stop what you are doing right now. All of my work here was for a reason. You are undoing everything in my life,"
she said with anger riddling her voice.
"You will stop right now."
Brady stood stunned, dropping one of the dolls to the floor. The two of them looked eye to eye.
"Stop,"
she said again. "Nana, me and Mom, we are your life's work. These are just dolls you made out of people you were mad at. You're angry even where you are today, and you shouldn't be. Where you are, you're not supposed to be mad at anything," said Brady.
"Stop! Never! The never! Never! The never!"
Brady just stood there slightly gulping as he looked at the floor, at the doll that he had dropped. Slowly Brady leaned down and picked up the doll. His grandmother, looking at him, shook her head no as he looked upon the doll. He pulled out another pin, which set off the room as though he'd pulled the trigger on what would turn the basement into chaos. The shoeboxes flew out of the basement room and circled the room about 3 feet from the floor as the tops flew off and the dolls fell to the room, hundreds of them.
"What are you doing?"
the voice of his grandmother said as she had disappeared.
Brady, you must stop now!
Brady continued to pull out the pins and items from each voodoo doll as the hurricane-like wind engulfed the basement, wind coming from nowhere. Every window of the house suddenly blew out, spraying glass all over the street. A biker flew off his bike outside of the house as the glass sprayed him, and the force threw him off his cycle. "Stop!" said Brady. "Stop, Graham! This isn't you!" Silence. The boxes dropped to the ground, and for the next 40 minutes, Brady would pull each pin from the dolls. "Brady!" a voice screamed from the top of the stairs of the basement. "Brady!" The voice was his mother, Tina Lavoie. "Are you all right, Brady?" Brady stood there as he saw a hole create itself on the basement floor. The dolls dropped into the hole as Tina walked down the stairs to witness it. Behind her, Claire DiStefano of the CDC and Special Agent Dal Richards. What they were witnessing was beyond their comprehension. Brady ran up the stairs, and Tina took his hand as all three ran back up the stairs. The hole had disappeared in the basement floor, and the basement appeared spotless besides the desk that Valerie had always sat behind. Running out of the house, glass was all over the lawn and stairs as they ran down them. Savannah police swarmed the house. Officers and Special Agent Cynthia Bork got out of one of the cars and approached Brady, Tina, Claire DiStefano, and FBI Agent Dal Richards. "We have a warrant to search the property," said an unknowing Cynthia. Claire looked at FBI Agent Cynthia Bork. "You don't want to go in there," she said. Chapter 30. Brady, Tina, and the swarm of psychologists and FBI agents and local police sat in the cafeteria of the Memorial Hospital of Savannah. King Kiyama sat next to Brady and his mother. "We've had a team of officers and agents swarming your grandmother's house. We don't know what to make of any of this," said Claire DiStefano of the CDC. "You keep making the mistake of believing you have a scientific explanation for this. There is none, ma'am. There is none," said the king. "We can't just let go of the chaos this city has seen. We need to have some explanation about what has happened here, and this boy knows what the hell is going on. He knows what this is all about," said Chief Marlon Frey. "You fool. You know nothing about any of this. Frankly, even I am at a loss for some of this," said the king. "Brady, tell them what you know," said Tina Lavoie. "I don't know, Ma. She was very angry. Gran was angry, and she had—" "A power," the king replied. "Everyone in this room is terrified, but they know it is true. They have applied all modern methods of explaining what they can't. There is no fall guy here. This will never be something you can put in a report because you will all be looked at as if you are insane," he said. "You need to let this go." "Letting this go is not something we do. We solve crimes. What happened in Savannah was a crime. People were laid up in those beds in comas for no reason that we know of. That's true. But that kid knows something," said Chief Frey. "I don't know anything, man. Nothing, man." "Lower the tone," said Tina. "He needs to ask these questions." "What about you, Tina?" said Chief Frey. "Chief Frey, why don't you give us all a moment?" she said. Tensions were high as Chief Frey, feeling disgusted about this entire situation, stormed out of the cafeteria. "They know something," he yelled as he walked off. King Kiyama stood up among those in the room. An officer approached him. "What about this?" a young officer said. "We found this in the basement." Brady looked at what was in the man's hand. It was a voodoo doll. It had nothing but a small blue piece of cloth pinned to it with the words "Never" written in black Sharpie on its forehead. Brady stood up. "It says never, man! It says never! None of the dolls said never. None of the dolls had anything written on them, man! Don't take that pin out! She said never! The never!" "Whatever you say," said the officer as he pulled the pin out of the voodoo doll and the blue piece of fabric that had been pinned to it fell to the floor. "No!" said King Kiyama. The lights to the entire cafeteria began to blink as the sound of machines throughout the hospital made a collective sound of chaos. My God, what is happening? What is happening, Brady?" said Tina. "I don't know. When I was in the basement today, Graham said never the never. You spoke to your grandmother today?" she said in complete shock. The building rumbled, the lights flashed, the glass began to explode out of the windows. "What the fuck is happening?" said Agent Richards. People began to run for cover as fear overtook the hospital. "She said never the never. She was talking about that doll. The whole of the basement took every doll she had, but they found that one. They found that one." "You're all fucking crazy," said Dr. Elliot Claiborne, the psychologist from Harvard University. "Really? Is that your diagnosis?" The cafeteria lights blew out, but for one, it set the tone that was acceptable to the silver eyes to comfort those silver eyes of Baron Samedi. Baron Samedi stood in the cafeteria with his signature top hat.
"You fools."
In room 203H, the eyes of the one unawakened patient opened wide. Chapter 31. "Langlandsau," said the man as a nurse stood over him. The nurse, shocked that he had wakened, ran to get a doctor in the corridor of the hospital. "Doctor, come quick!" she yelled. The doctor ran into the room and to the man, the last patient who had awakened. The man Baron Samedi told King Kiame would never wake up. King Kiame stopped at the entrance of the room. "It's him! Don't go near him," said the king. Baron Samedi appeared to hover above the awakened man, levitating over the bed. Claire DiStefano and Agent Richards, among the other officers, stood in shock as they witnessed what they were seeing. What? Said Claire, unable to complete a sentence or a question. Baron's head looked toward King Kiame.
"I told you this one would not wake up. You have woken him up."
"Langlandsau," said the man, still unable to get up from the bed, but certainly trying to. Baron Samedi hovered above him.
"You cannot come back," said Baron. "You must not come back."
Officers of Savannah police stormed the room, guns drawn.
"Do not shoot this man. Sleep,"
said Baron Samedi as the officers fell to the floor of the hospital, unconscious from the mere words of Baron. "It's not the man," said King. "It's what's inside the man. This must be what Valerie was containing, but she was becoming like him." King Kiame and Baron Samedi were now the only two authorities in the world who mattered, as they took aim at the man who had awakened. King pulled feathers from a handmade pouch he had created. "Turn off the lights," he said as he pulled out 3 candles, placing them on both sides of the room, with one on the floor of the hospital room entrance. Claire and the other officers just stood in disbelief as they watched Baron Samedi hovering above the patient. King Kiame lit the candles and spoke. "Disappear now, with the moon. Go quickly over to the herb and then go. Vanish because I order you. Disappear overnight like the moonlight. I am joy and health. I am strength and power." Once again the lights within the hospital flickered as the windows blew out on the floor. "Who is Langlandsau?" yelled Claire. King looked at Baron. Baron looked at Claire.
"Don't look into my eyes."
Claire turned away her face as she listened in fear of the man hovering above the patient.
"Langlandsau is judgment. He executes judgment. He does what Valerie was doing. Langlandsau is a fierce Loa, strong and hard. He executes judgment on those who can't keep their word, and the Haugon or Mambo who can't keep the voodoo secrets from the uninitiate ones. He likes everything that tear the flesh. Langlandsau. So the man trapped inside this body will be destroyed by Langlandsau regardless. King, repeat the words. I came to let Valerie in, but Langlandsau is a spirit that cannot be allowed to render judgment to the other side. And that would be his mission.
Don't bother, said Valerie Lavoie as she walked into the room of the hospital. Silence overcame the room. Valerie Lavoie walked into a hospital room she had earlier been pronounced dead in. "The Queen of White Magic, it is now you," said King Kiyame.
"It is now me,"
she replied. Valerie walked over to the body of the man.
"I can't save both. I can't save one. But the prison of both is now undone,"
she said as she put her hand on the head of the man who had awakened. "Thank you," said the man. Valerie smiled at the man who was now released to the new life after this one. The room remained stunned, and Baron backed up from where he levitated and stood on his feet again.
"Hello, Queen Valerie. I'm glad you showed up."
Tina and Brady slowly walked up to Valerie.
"Mom?"
said Tina. Valerie smiled at them both.
"I've got to go, but thank you. Thank you, Brady. You were right. You have set me free."
Tina began crying.
"Stop your tears, Tina. I'm okay. I will see you in the blink of an eye,"
said Valerie.
"We must go,"
said Baron Simity. Valerie looked at the officers and Claire Di Stefano.
"I know you don't know what to say. Take what you have seen with you. There is more than you think to this world. You are all authorities of this world, so treat each other better. My grandson has shown me who I am again."
Claire just shook her head and her body trembling. The other officers looked at her in awe.
"Till I see you again,"
Valerie said as both disappeared. There would never be a report filed. A little girl, who would later have her tonsils removed, would find a curious doll beneath her bed.
"Mom?"
the little girl asked.
"Yes,"
her mom replied to the 7-year-old.
"What does never mean?"
Her mom picked up the doll off the floor, looking curious as the word never that was written on the forehead of the strange little hand-sewed doll.
"Odd. I'll put it through the wash."
This has been Savannah, written by Brian Evans, Theodore Hamby III, edited by Kainoe Jacinto, narrated by Ben Tvler. Copyright 2016 by Brian Evans. Production copyright 2016 by Brian Evans.